Cute, cute. Arguably, redheads don't have souls as well, according to some people. Hello, everyone. I'm not 100% sure if it's working today, but we are recording it, so I'll upload it to YouTube. God damn. I trust you. I trust you. From what I don't know if blackheads don't have souls. Yeah, I noticed that last time the rain was like really, really, really soft, but I can always lower the volume to it if it's too loud. So let's see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 books that I chose stories from, as well as a story on my e-reader. Hopefully it will last a whole 3 hours. If not, we're gonna start an epic. I am not a collector of souls. If they are donated, then fine, I'll give them a home, but I'm not going to collect them or take them from people. Anywho, I figured since last time we did quite a bit of fairy tales that we'll just go into more folklore today. Starting off with probably the Myrmidons. Myrmidons. They originate, goodness, from Greek mythology. You should collect them for Cthulhu. He does need feeding, you are 100% right. The sickness has spread through the entire island like wildfire. Not one villager spared, not one beast tolerant to the disease. As the days passed, the skin began to melt off the bodies of the islanders that didn't die instantly upon Hera's curse. The entire island began to reek of the stench of decomposing human and creature flesh alike. Within weeks, Hera's act of jealousy was complete. Her plague had destroyed all life forms on the island, or so she had thought. When Zeus tread on the island to see the havoc Hera had caused, he noticed that the ants of the island, still toiling away and growing their cities, unaffected by the cure of the plague. Immediately, Zeus cast a spell upon the ants. Before his eyes, he saw those tiny creatures morph. Their bodies grew bigger at first, their limbs collapsing down to 4, their pincers transformed into a set of human lips, their abdomens reshaped into a human torso. Before Zeus could rejoice at his glory, an entire army stood before him, a new race of people. Oops. These are the Myrmidons, legendary inhabitants of Thessaly in Greece. They are known for their fierce devotion to Achilles, the king who led them in the Trojan War. Known for their brute strength and the possession of a hive mentality-like strategies in battle, they were known to be defeatable only if their leader was to fall. Historically, the only real army to come close to this sort of tenacity were the Spartans. Oops. One must wonder if the fictional writings of an author can directly influence the development of an entire army, or is there perhaps any truth to this mythological army of any men? I think they meant to say ant-men, but that's okay. Did Greek authors, in fact, draw from observations and not their imaginations? In fact, it is well known that the battle strategies of the Spartans, where soldiers huddled close together to create a strong wall that not only protects each other but almost acts as a battering ram heading towards the enemy, was finessed and mastered by the Romans. And to think this all began from an epic tale like the Iliad within an infamous Greek poem, Working Days. The word Myrmidon is a combination of 2 Greek words, myrmex, meaning ant, and demos, meaning a person or people. Myrmidons are referenced in Greek stories. One of them is by Hesiod in his poem, Works and Days. Hesiod advises an honest working life, which is the source of all good. He feels that both gods and men despise those who are not hardworking enough to work. Wow, this is kind of redundant. Anyway, this is why Hesiod must have taken an interest in the myth of the Myrmidons. He showed them as human beings who labored underground for gold that was guarded over by ants. In Homer's tale of the Iliad, the Myrmidons are the soldiers commanded by Achilles. Their ancestor was Their ancestor was Hermodon, who was a son of Zeus, and Eurymedos, a princess of oh my gosh, I forgot about this. Phthoisis? She was known to have been seduced by him in the form of an ant. Essentially, Homer's version is an etiological myth explaining the origin of myrmidons by expanding upon their supposed etymology. The name, in classical Greek, was interpreted as ant people, from Remkes, which was the first mentioned by Ovid in the Metamorphoses. In Ovid's telling of the tales of the myrmidons, he claimed them to be simple working ants on the island of Aegina. The origin of myrmidons seemed to have been connected to an active jealousy in other Greek tales. Hera, the queen of the gods, had sent a plague to kill all the human inhabitants of Aegina, something like that, because the island was named after one of the lovers of Zeus. The ants of the islands were unaffected by the sickness, so Zeus responded to Hera's act of jealousy by transforming the surviving ants into a race of people, the myrmidons. Hi, Tato. Thank you for the resub. They were as fierce and hardy as ants and intensely loyal to their leader. Because of their antly origins, they wore brown armor. Here's a fun fact that not only did ancient Greeks get wrong, but so do modern-day pop culture enthusiasts. Ants are mostly females. Males that exist within an ant colony live for a very short period and only to serve the queen ant. Imagine if Hollywood was to take this societal norm amongst the ants into consideration. Perhaps we would have seen a very different Myrmidon army that was led by Achilles in the movie Troy. On deception, like other yokai do, but what makes them unique is their spider-like behavior. I'm starting to realize that this book is written kind of crappily. I'm sorry. So for those of you who play Final Fantasy, the next one that I chose today is Garuda, who originates from Indian mythology. The mother of the birds, Vinata, anxiously watched her remaining egg. She had been waiting for hundreds of years for it to hatch, and the time was drawing near. She would not let impatience get the better of her again, even with the serpents ruling over her home, her marriage. She had broken her first egg early, eager for a son to support and protect her from her husband's other wife and their 1,000 serpent sons. While their husband was away meditating in the forest. Dan, answer please. Have we been living in a mutual episode? Yes, probably. Wind mommy. But in breaking the egg, she inadvertently weakened her son, born not fully formed and angry with her for her mistake. Oh, Aruna, she missed him every day, even though she could see he pulled the chariot of the sun across the sky. Refocusing her gaze on the heat emanating in waves from her precious giant egg, the shell suddenly split open in a burst of fire. A glowing golden bird was rising from the egg, growing larger and larger in front of her eyes. Still larger and larger he grew, towering above her. He threw out his wings in a movement that shook the heavens. Even the gods took notice and begged for mercy from this huge fiery creature. He heeded them and shrunk himself down to a more amenable size. At last, Garuda was born. This is a tale of Garuda's birth, and from this dramatic entrance, he has been involved in many exciting adventures since. In Hindu mythology, Garuda is described as a giant kite. He is depicted in early Indian temples, such as the Badami caves in India, as far back as the 6th century. Garuda is perhaps most famous for being the mount of the Hindu supreme god Vishnu. There is a particular story about how this came about as a consequence of Garuda's other escapades. After Garuda was born, his mother was tricked into slavery by her husband's other wife, Karuda, also known as the mother of serpents. Garuda was known for her cunning and ambition. She wanted her 1,000 serpent sons to have more power than any bird. When Garuda's elder brother Aruna heard of their mother's predicament, he charged Garuda with securing her release from Garuda's clutches. Garuda immediately grew to a size so immense that one flap of his wings could take him anywhere in the world. He negotiated with the horde of serpent sons who said they would release his mother only in return for the elixir of immortality, the Amrita, held safely in heaven where they could not go. Garuda agreed, and with another flap of his colossal wings, he flew up to the heavens to ask the gods for the elixir that would secure his mother's freedom. But the gods did not believe him, and thought he wanted the elixir to make himself immortal. In a rage, Garuda grew so large that one almighty flap of his wings scattered the gods across the skies, enabling him to snatch the elixir. On his way down from heaven, Garuda encountered Vishnu, who evidently did believe him. Vishnu requests that Garuda become his mount, and in return he will grant Garuda immortality. When Garuda reaches the serpent's lair, he plays them at their own game. He presents them with the elixir, but says they have to purify themselves before they can drink it in order to become immortal. While they hastily slither off to do so, Garuda frees his mother. When the serpents return, he feasts mercilessly on all of them. Garuda returns the elixir to the heavens and enters into the service as Vishnu's mount. Next, can we worship marine study? We can. I don't have anything on that, and I'm not familiar with it, but I can look it up. This story offers an explanation as to why many birds of prey eat snakes, and why Garuda is often depicted as carrying a pot of Amrita, as well as his wings. He sometimes has 2 or 4 arms. Another tale makes it clear that Garuda is immune to snake venom. This is why his image is so popular on charms and amulets to protect people from snakes and snake bites. In the days of old, people left delectable offerings to both heaven and the underworld. Garuda represented heaven, while the many-headed snake, Kalia, represented the underworld. Thinking his venom would be enough to protect him from Garuda's wrath, Kalia insolently ate all of the offerings. As Hinduism spread to Nepal and Southeast Asia, Garuda traveled with it. In Buddhism, Garuda represents wisdom and a whole race of birds rather than one individual. The Garudas are natural enemies of the serpents, with only the Buddha himself able to call for peace between them. Though originally depicted in animal form, Garuda is often seen in anthropomorphized, I'll say that 10 times fast, form of the body of a man, but with wings, beak, or a hooked nose, and sharp talons. Images of Garuda became more human-like as his story spread throughout Southeast Asia. But then he is said to have the ability to shapeshift into a human at will, in addition to changing his size. Many statues of Garuda can be seen throughout many Southeast Asian countries. Representations of Garuda are included in royal and military insignias, and he is in a national emblem in Thailand and Indonesia. He even forms the Indian Air Force coat of arms, representing courage. On one hand, Garuda symbolizes deadly speed, violence, and military prowess, while on the other, he is beloved for symbolizing virtue, protection, and hope. Okay, next. Fenrir, origins Norse mythology. Fenrir lies motionless as if his giant wolf body has been turned to stone and become part of the earth. The tight bindings around his legs and neck prevent him from moving, and the sword through his muzzle keeps him from making a sound. His piercing eyes are closed, and he senses the passing of night and day. He has lost track of how long he has been trapped like this, but his agony seems endless. His pointed ears hear everything, while he bides his time, waiting for revenge. Fenrir festers, the feelings of betrayal as raw as if it all happened yesterday. He would wreak havoc on those responsible for this. He will make them pay. He will kill the god Odin. Fenrir is a giant wolf from Norse mythology. He is often portrayed as an enormous wolf with a shaggy black coat, rows of sharp fangs, and intense fiery eyes. His incredible strength and vicious temperament are evident in many paintings of Fenrir. Several surviving carvings and runestones depict Fenrir in the United Kingdom and Sweden, highlighting Fenrir's importance in Norse mythology. He is also described in the Poetic Eddas, particularly in the tale of his binding. Though Fenrir is associated with much ferocious imagery, he was once just a pup. Fenrir is the son of Loki, the trickster god, and Angerboda, the giantess, meaning she who bodes anguish. Loki has 3 children with Angerboda. Fenrir's siblings are Hel, the girl of life and death, and Jormungandr, the giant serpent. One night, the god Odin receives a prophecy foretelling that Loki's 3 monstrous children will cause a great deal of trouble and disaster. This destruction is inevitable because the nature of their giant mother combined with the nature of their mischievous and untrustworthy father. Odin sees his own death in Fenrir's jaws. He decides to act to prevent this morbid prediction from coming to pass. Odin calls for Loki's children to be brought from the land of the giants. He thinks of finding some occupation to keep them out of trouble, while also keeping them far away from the gods. Odin sends the giant serpent into the sea and Hel into the underworld to rule over the dead who do not go to Valhalla. That leaves Fenrir who has grown even on the journey to Asgard. Odin decides to keep Fenrir among them, thinking that it is too unsafe to send him away, even though he believes Fenrir will cause his death. As Fenrir grows ever larger and more muscular, only the god Tyr is brave enough to approach him and feed him. Being one of the gods that collected him from the land of the giants when he was a pup, Tyr has no doubt grown fond of him, and Fenrir has not done any harm, yet. Odin knows that even a docile young wolf may grow up to challenge and kill its own parents for dominance in the pack, and Fenrir is no ordinary wolf. The gods become increasingly afraid of Fenrir and know his strength now far surpasses their own. Considering the ominous prophecy, the gods decide that Fenrir should be tied up to keep him from harming anybody. The first chain they make is not strong enough, and they make a game of it with Fenrir, saying it's a chance to test his strength and become famous. Fenrir agrees to be chained up, but breaks the chain with such ease that the gods are more afraid than before, though they cheer and clap, congratulating Fenrir on his strength. The gods make a second chain, mighty in size and twice as strong as the first. Fenrir again agrees to be chained up for a chance to prove his strength and gain recognition. After a struggle, Fenrir manages to break the second chain, proudly standing free. Again, the gods deviously congratulate him on his strength, but they are now very worried. Odin decides to commission a binding from the dwarves, known to be the most masterful craftsmen in all the lands. The dwarves use some special materials to make the binding: the footsteps of a cat, the sinews of a bear, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the breath of a fish, and the spit of a bird. If any of these are now hard to find, perhaps the dwarves used them all up to make the third binding. When they were finished, the dwarves had produced a long, smooth ribbon that was, despite its appearance, unbreakable. When Odin took it to Fenrir to supposedly test his strength, Fenrir took one look at it and suspected treachery. What fame would he achieve from breaking a ribbon? The gods taunted him, saying that he was afraid of the ribbon. Fenrir said he would consent to being tied by this ribbon if someone put their hand in his mouth as a show of trust. He would let them go as soon as they untied him if he could not break free from the ribbon. The gods agreed to the oath. They looked at each other. No one was prepared to sacrifice their hand. When Tyr stepped forward and laid his wrist across Fenrir's teeth, he knew binding Fenrir was going to cost him his hand, and it did. For this reason, Tyr is known as the god of law and justice, and he made a sacrifice for the greater good of his people. However, at the time of Ragnarok, the end of the world, the ground will shake so violently that any bindings will be broken. Fenrir will be free again to seek his revenge. Good night, Swedish. I hope you have sweet dreams, and I hope you actually sleep through the night tonight. We love you. Okay. Next up, Echidna, originating from Greek mythology. And if it's confusing, the first little bit that I read is in italics, which is from, I'm assuming, the original mythology of it, then a further description is given of it. I should have probably prefaced this with that. The traveler followed the hoof prints of his missing horses. The morning was too cold for such a miserable task. His horses wouldn't have wandered off in the night. They must have been stolen. It was hard to track them over the rocky terrain, but every so often he found a recent hoof mark on the frosty ground. Why hadn't he heard anything in the night? Something didn't add up. After following the tracks for a time, he came across a large cluster of boulders. Yes, good night, sweetest. He noticed an opening in the ground between them. The trail of hoof prints disappeared, and he looked around, perplexed. Suddenly, a movement caught his eye. From out of the hole began to emerge a beautiful woman. Her glossy hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her skin was smooth and fair, and her eyes were dark and enticing. He lost track of what he was doing there for a moment. He shook himself out of it. "Have you seen any horses?" he asked. He was waiting for the rest of this lovely creature to emerge from the boulders. He didn't wholly disapprove of the way she was looking at him. It made him forget to question what she was doing out here in the middle of nowhere. As she emerged, however, instead of legs, she had the body of a snake. An echidna, he thought, shocked but equally mesmerized. "Horses? Yes, I've seen them. Come inside and I'll tell you about them," she replied in a voice that could not be disobeyed. The earliest descriptions of Echidna tell of the torso and head of a beautiful young nymph who never grows old, with the lower body of a colossal viper. She had black eyes set in a fair face and long flowing hair. Venomous and fierce, Echidna had a voracious thirst for blood, and, as a flesh-eating monster, could destroy mortals with ease. Echidna lived beneath the earth in a cave and preyed upon unsuspecting passers-by, carrying them off and devouring them. In the natural world, echidnas are named after Echidna in Greek mythology because they both have mammalian and reptilian features. Echidna is said to symbolize the negative watery aspects of the earth, like stagnant pools, decay, and disease. This aqueous element fits with her being a descendant of the primordial sea god Ceto and Phorcys, as they symbolize the dangers of the deep, although some sources cite alternative parents. As a powerful yet beautiful monster, she also represents the perceived threat of strong, attractive women in the patriarchal society of ancient Greece. Echidna was described as unimaginable, indicating a strong, independent character. Because she bore many children, she most notably represents creation and potentiality, and in a broader sense, the cause of disorder in nature. Echidna found a suitable companion to match her power in Typhon, the many-headed dragon, son of Gaia and Tartarus. Echidna and Typhon lived together in their subterranean home and had a growing family. The partnership of Echidna and Typhon mirrors that of Zeus and his wife Hera, and the feud between them had repercussions for generations. It is her offspring that Echidna is most well known for, and the reason she is called the mother of monsters. Echidna and Typhon's first two children were multi-headed dogs, with serpent tails, Orthus and Cerberus. Following these two brutal brothers were the Hydra, a regenerating multi-headed serpent, the Chimera, a lion-goat-snake hybrid, and the Sphinx, part woman, part winged lion. As time went on, multiple writers associated more creatures to the mother of monsters. On the surface, On the surface, Echidna may merely appear to be a convenient character to attribute monstrous offspring to because she does not have a prominent role in famous myths. However, most of these myths do involve her children or grandchildren. While Echidna herself avoided being a main opponent to any heroes, there is one story, and Echidna matches her description very closely. On the way home from his 10th labor, Hercules was lured by a cave-dwelling Echidna while looking for his missing horses that she had stolen and hidden. The Echidna was half beautiful maiden and half snake, and told Hercules that he could have his horses back if he stayed with her for a while. Thus she bore 3 sons, Agathyrsus, Galenus, and Scythes, who she brought up in the cave after she eventually allowed Hercules to leave with his horses. All 3 sons went on to be the fathers of mortal tribes. The youngest son, Scythes, became the king of Scythia. It is likely that this story was intended to warn against beautiful and intelligent women like Echidna herself, and that these characteristics were somehow undesirable or unnatural. This is emphasized by the stark contrast between the womanly torso and the snake body. Perhaps Echidna was smart enough to avoid the limelight, but was nonetheless a powerful driving force behind her children and her husband Typhon in his tirade against the Olympian gods. As history has been known to forget the influence of great women, maybe mythology has forgotten the influence of a great female monster. While details of Echidna are limited, her effects are felt throughout many of the most famous Greek myths. Haizun, originating from Islamic mythology. The soldier knew their army was outnumbered, but facing him was a single opponent launching a fierce attack with his sword. The soldier only managed to block the strike. He shifted his speed, ready to counterstrike, but when he thrust his sword, it met air. To his surprise, his opponent, so determined to kill him a moment ago, had suddenly turned to flee. The soldier roared and raced after him with his sword aloft. Fleetingly, the soldier thought he had heard the pounding of hooves, but the air trembled instead of the ground. A stranger's voice called out, "Forward, Haizun!" from somewhere above his right shoulder, but no one was there. He couldn't help thinking, "My name isn't Haizun." He refocused on his quarry. He had nearly caught him. As the soldier ran, an errant gust of wind blasted him with dust. He heard the crack of a whip, and, wiping the sand from his face, saw his quarry crumpled on the ground. When he reached him, he saw his face was sliced open from one temple across his nose to the opposite cheek. The wound was red, raw at the edges, but sickeningly discolored, where the flesh gaped, as if it was already infected with some strange poison. Again, he looked around, but there was no one to be seen, only the enemy retreating behind a rolling cloud of dust. He couldn't believe his eyes. "Forward, Haizun," he whispered to himself, and with a flash of realization, Haizun is the horse of an angel. According to Islamic traditional writings, elaborations based on the Quran, Haizun is the horse of the Archangel Gabriel, a gift from God for being a faithful servant. Haizun is of pure white skin to the point that he appears luminous to those lucky enough to see him. Haizun is a fitting mount for an angel because he can travel between cosmic planes instantaneously with his large white feathered wings. This enables Gabriel to pass on divine messages to prophets, including the prophet Muhammad. Apparently, Haizun was chosen for Gabriel because he was the most intelligent animal in the universe. This highlights the cultural significance of horses and how intelligent they were considered to be, offering valuable assistance to humans and angels alike. But in the Battle of Badr, Muslim troops numbering just over 300 faced 1,000 Quraysh, a mercantile Arab tribe and staunch opponent of Muhammad and his religious message. Moreover, the Muslim army had only 2 horses, and the enemy had many. Muhammad, who was leading the Muslim troops, was distressed that they were so severely outnumbered and prayed fervently to God that they would not all be slaughtered and Islam wiped out before it had truly begun. His prayers were answered as 1,000 angels were sent to secure their victory. Muhammad saw a great sandstorm roll through the valley during the battle, though there was no wind and the ground was soaked from heavy rain the previous night. He saw Gabriel, an angel of revelation, mounted on his white horse Haizun, leading half of the angels into battle. The angel Michael, the field commander of the angels, led the other half. Gabriel's battle cry could be heard, "Forward, Haizun," as they rode the waves of dust, and no hooves touched the ground. The Quraysh turned their backs and began to flee. Those who were not quick enough were trampled. Now Muhammad knew that he would be victorious and his followers would survive. Due to the aid of the mounted angels, they lived to show mercy to their prisoners. Another traditional story is that of the golden calf, which is mentioned in the Quran. While Moses was away fasting and praying, some of his followers grew restless, awaiting his return, and were filled with doubt. One of his followers, named Samiri, persuaded the other Israelites that Moses had deserted them and was not coming back. Samiri convinced everyone to give him their gold coins and jewelry, which he then melted down to make a golden calf. He had some dust from under the hooves of Haizun, and he threw it into the calf's mouth, making it seem as if it was partly alive. Such was the power of the dust. The Israelites were amazed and worshipped the golden calf when Samiri claimed that this was their guiding god. Moses returned and asked Samiri why he had done this. He replied that he was responding to the inclination of his soul when he threw Haizun's dust. After some discussion and other mishaps, everyone prayed for forgiveness for worshipping a false idol. By the time Islam was created, the time of Greek mythology had passed, the gods forgotten, and only Greek philosophical and scientific texts were translated into the Islamic world. However, a white-winged horse had been immortalized in the stars. The constellation of Pegasus was familiar in the early Islamic world and had the name of Faras al-Azam, meaning great horse. Astronomy and astrology were culturally valued, so the white-winged horse was incorporated into Islamic tradition. There is a stunning Iranian luster bowl from the late 12th century showing a winged horse, the very likeness of Haizun, considered to be derived from Pegasus. Haizun has the crucial task of transporting the angel Gabriel with his divine messages. He also represents an explanation for sandstorms, which look like they have been whipped up by angels or stampeding horses. Though known for many different names, the white-winged horse remains one of the most recognizable mythological creatures in the world. Okay, last one for this book, and then we'll get to the next one. And, adjusting in my seat because I started to slump down. Kelpie, origin Scottish folklore. One evening, a man walking home saw the river he needed to cross was flooded and too fast moving for him to go safely. Hydrate. Okay. I saw like a flicker of something on my screen, and I was like, Stretch. Oh my god, will not. Thank you for reminding me. As he was about to turn around, he saw a gray pony grazing on the riverbank. The man approached it. It made no objections to his presence and allowed him to jump onto its back. He was a confident rider and had quickly decided that this was the perfect way to cross the river and return to his family as planned. However, as soon as he was seated, the horse charged off into the deepest and most turbulent part of the river. By the time the man realized it was too late, this was no horse. It was a kelpie taking him to his death. The most common water spirit in Scottish folklore is the kelpie, a type of water horse. It is a shape-shifting aquatic creature that can take the form of a horse or human on land. Kelpies usually show themselves as handsome gray or black horses and possess exceptional strength and stamina. They lurk around bodies of water, usually rivers, that have deep pools for them to inhabit. Their coats are enchanted, so if you touch them, you cannot break free. The most likely candidate for the word origin of kelpie is the Gaelic word cailpeach, meaning colt, a young male horse. Surprise, I chose one too. Almost every significant body of water in Scotland has an associated kelpie story, and the common theme is that if you get onto their back, you are doomed to drown. The variety of local stories imply a host of different kelpies within a wide range of personalities and characteristics. Some regional variations include a kelpie with serpents in its mane, some with hooves pointing the wrong way, and one that sings to entice you onto its back. It is said you should look out for a dripping wet mane or water weeds in the hair of the kelpie disguised as a person. Kelpies are almost always considered malevolent and said to prey on humans, leaving only entrails thrown out onto the riverbank. Across Scotland, a tale is told of 10 children who unknowingly met a kelpie as they played near a river. 9 of the children climbed onto its back, but the 10th child, a boy, was reluctant. The kelpie wanted all 10 children and followed the boy. The young boy, thinking the horse was being friendly, stretched out his arm to gingerly stroke the horse's nose. Immediately, his fingers became stuck, and, as the horse turned, dragged him towards the river with the other children still on its back. He knew it was a kelpie. Shouting to the other children, he quickly took his pocket knife and cut off his own fingers to free himself. The other 9 children were stuck on the kelpie's back and couldn't get off. They were carried away and drowned, their innards later found on the riverbank. In contrast to this malicious intent, kelpies are also seen as seeking human companionship, but in most cases, it is probably a pretense to lure people onto their backs to drown them. However, one story shows at least some kelpies are capable of human-like feelings. There was once a lonely kelpie who had seen a girl he longed to marry. He turned himself into a handsome young man to woo her. The girl, however, recognized him for a kelpie and took his silver necklace while he was sleeping. It was his bridle and the source of his power. Without it, he was forced into his horse shape and put to work on the family farm for a year. Questioning her actions, the young woman took the kelpie to see a wise man. He said she should return the kelpie's silver necklace, which she did, allowing him to resume his human form once more. He professed that he still wanted to marry her, and this time she agreed. The wise man granted the kelpie a mortal life, and they were married. Right? Horses that disembowel you? Hot damn. Gaining control over a kelpie and putting their strength to work does not always have a happy outcome. For example, the Laird of Morphy forced a kelpie to build his home by making it wear a halter with a cross on it. When the Laird's home was finished, he set the kelpie free, but it cursed him, and the Morphy family line died out. Also related to Tack, an ancestor of the MacGregor clan, managed to take a kelpie's bridle. Powerless and destined to die within a day without its bridle, the kelpie tried to reclaim it, but was outsmarted by MacGregor. Subsequently, the bridle was said to give healing properties to water and was passed down as a family heirloom. While kelpies in human form are almost always male, in one story, a kelpie appeared as a disgruntled old woman and drowned 2 people in a river. Despite this, most paintings of kelpies show them as nude, waterside maidens, clearly a sizable step away from the catalog of traditional folklore. The kelpie stories warn people of the danger of flooded rivers, deep pools, and hidden currents. These all represent a genuine risk of drowning, and the stories may have originated as an attempt to rationalize both children and adults lost to tragic accidents. Evolving into cautionary tales, they may have helped keep children away from dangerous waters, as well as young women away from handsome strangers. Alright, one book down. Next one. This one doesn't have as many pages that I marked. Oh, actually it has more. Just kidding. Okay, the Anansi, originating in West African folklore and mythology. I'm going to ask for forgiveness because these are West African names and I'm not all that sure about pronunciation. Takuma sat on the ground, watching his father trying to climb a tall tree. For some reason, he had a bottle gourd fastened to his stomach, tied on with a string creeper. Maybe this was something to do with his father's quest to collect the wisdom of the world. "Father, what are you doing?" asked Takuma. But his father did not reply. He was struggling to climb the tree because the bottle gourd kept getting in the way of his many legs. He climbed up a little and then fell down on his rump yet again. Takuma made a suggestion. "Father, open your eyes. Why don't you tie the gourd to your back so you can climb?" After another failed attempt with the gourd on his back, Takuma's father followed After another failed attempt with the gourd on his stomach, Takuma's father followed his young son's advice and climbed easily to the top of the tree. He sat on a high branch and spoke to Takuma. "I thought I had collected all the wisdom of the world in this gourd," he said, holding it aloft. "I was going to hide it up here for safekeeping, but you have shown me some wisdom I left behind. So it all seems a bit pointless now." And with that, Anansi, the spider, threw his gourd as far as he could, spilling wisdom out all over the land. Anansi is a mischievous spider from West Africa, and features many stories that explain moral values and good behavior, such as sharing wisdom. A character originating in Ghana, in the Akan language, Anansi means spider. As a spider, Anansi's head is much smaller than his body, and this is because spirits taught him how to detach the top of his skull, which he accidentally stuck to his rear end. In some stories, Anansi and his wife also appear as human, so they have the ability to shapeshift. Anansi is usually depicted as a black spider with a cheeky anthropomorphized face. Rather than his appearance, it is his character that is important to the many tales he features in. Anansi is a clever trickster who is adept at turning his weaknesses or feelings to his advantage. Anansi's stories spread from Africa, with the slave trade, to the Caribbean and beyond, so there are a wide variety of tales. There is much debate whether the Anansi stories are folklore or myth, since in some areas Anansi is considered the son of the gods, while others argue that Anansi is not worshipped, and divine links are thus not relevant to most of the stories. So even though most Anansi stories are considered folklore, some have a divine element, like the following. Anansi loved to talk, and thought he would make an excellent storyteller, so one day he visited Niame, the sky god, who was the keeper of all stories. Anansi respectfully asked Niame if he could buy the stories. Niame replied that the cost was a python, a leopard, a fairy, and some hornets. Many people had asked for the stories, but none had been able to pay. Niame was sure this was an impossible task, and that the stories would remain in his possession. Anansi went home and made plans with his mother and wife. His wife gave him many excellent ideas, and he followed her advice. To capture the python, he piqued his vanity by saying he was not longer than a palm frond. While he ostensibly measured the python, Anansi tied him to the frond. For the leopard, he trapped him in a pit and hit him on the head. Next, Anansi pretended it was raining and took the hornets into a hollow bottle gourd for his shelter and closed the lid. Now to catch a fairy, you have to be particularly clever. Anansi's wife made a little doll, and Anansi carried it in sticky sap. His mother gave him some mashed yam in a small pot to tempt the fairies. When Anansi had laid the doll and yam mashed out under a tree, he hid. Soon a fairy came and spoke to the doll, asking if she could share the yam mash. The fairy became very cross when the doll did not reply, and slapped her. The fairy's hand was instantly stuck. She tried to free herself with her other hand, but that became stuck too. So Anansi took the python, leopard, hornets, and a very angry fairy up to the sky god. Niame was impressed and gave all of the stories to Anansi, and that is how they became known as spider stories instead of sky god stories. Some stories relate Niame as Anansi's father and his mother as the earth goddess. Tired of his son's mischief, Niame turned Anansi into a spider with only his wits to rely on. A common thread across all Anansi stories is thinking your way out of life's day-to-day problems. Sometimes Anansi teaches us a lesson, and sometimes other characters teach Anansi a lesson, and we learn from his mistakes. Often presenting philosophical lessons, In a comedic and informative way, Anansi the spider symbolizes cunning, humor, mischief, and perseverance in problem solving. Though Anansi is known to deceive others for his own ends, his actions prompt laughter as a tool to convey the intended message. As Anansi often outwits larger opponents, he can be seen as an important symbol of resistance against oppression. Siren, originating from Slavic folklore. Maxim heard it first. It was a beautiful song. He dropped his tools to the ground and searched the skies, looking for the source of the vocalizations. He noticed a huge owl sitting in an apple tree, even though it was midday, and he was pretty sure owls did not have a voice like that. He moved closer, but the bird flew away, still singing. He ran after it. He had to know what it was saying to him. It was so enchanting. He could think of nothing else. All his daily concerns fell away, like taking off a heavy coat, and he felt light and joyful. He ran and saw that the bird was perched again in another tree. This time it was facing him, and it had the lovely face of a woman. A small crown was perched on top of its dark plumage, topping off its serious expression as it sang its melodious song. Maxim was enraptured and could not look away. When the bird spread its wings and flew off again, he blissfully followed it. At the very back of his mind was a warning. This was the siren. Don't follow it to your death. But he paid the half-thought no heed and blindly followed the bird as it flew out to sea. Siren is a dark-colored, eerie bird, usually an owl, with the head and sometimes chest of a woman. She is famous for her sweet, captivating song, which is so engaging that it has mesmerizing effects and leads people to their ruin. Siren's song was intended for the benefit of saints, giving them divine encouragement or messages, but mortals could not survive it and would lose their minds. Hearing Siren's song made mortals forget all impermanent things and blindly follow her, even listening until they died in rapture. For this reason, people were said to try to scare Siren away with loud noises which he could not stand, such as ringing bells and cannon fire. People attempting to scare Siren away by these methods can be seen depicted in old woodblock prints. The same images show that Siren has wings but no arms, whereas her sister, Alkonost, who sometimes accompanies her, is often depicted with arms as well as wings. The similarity of the names Siren and Siren is not thought to be a coincidence. Just like her sister Alkonost, Siren has been influenced by Greek mythology. The Greek sirens used mesmerizing songs to lure unsuspecting sailors to their doom, similar to Siren, and were also part woman, part bird. However, the Greek sirens were more malicious in their intent. During the Middle Ages, Greek culture traveled northwards, and it is only natural that this included Greek myths. In earlier pagan times, peasants' cottages were often adorned with pairs of wooden carvings of Siren and Alkonost, as they were considered protective birds of good fortune. The carvings could guard the entrance of the household, Alkonost protecting it by day and Siren by night. As time went on, their personalities diverged, and they came to represent different aspects. In traditional pagan folklore, Siren and her sister are both from the otherworld island of Fuyan, or Viraj, a type of paradise where birds fly during winter migration, and the souls of the dead reside when their earthly lives are over. In the Slavic villages of ancient Europe, the day of Apelspas was always celebrated to mark the beginning of harvest time at the end of the summer, when autumn began. Until the Apelspas day, Siren in her stern face was said to inhabit the earthly realm. She would sit in the apple trees and sing melancholy song, her tears falling onto the trees and growing fruit. No one could eat the apples before Apelspas in case they were contaminated with Siren's sorrow. On the day of Apelspas, Alkonost, with her kind face, would fly into the orchard from paradise. She would laugh and sing a joyful song in the early afternoon, dispelling all misery and imbuing the fruit with healthful or even magical healing properties. After Alkonost's visit, the villagers would harvest the apples and celebrate their good fortune. They considered Alkonost a sign that the strength of love and faith was more important than money and power represented by Siren. At one time, it was said that Siren only appeared to happy people because it brought them heavenly joy to hear her fabulous song. Siren was said to be fleeting and pass quickly, just like happiness, which is why happiness and Siren were both so hard to find. When Christianity was introduced to the Slavic countries, Syrian was one of the creatures absorbed from Slavic folklore into Russian Orthodoxy. Being able to keep some of their favorite beliefs persuaded more people to accept the new religion of Christianity. With the advent of Christianity, Syrian's home was transferred to the Garden of Eden instead of Boyan Island, or the paradise of Viraj. This is why Syrian and Alkonost are both described as birds of paradise in later writings. Over time, they became more well known for their contrasting personality. Alkonost was seen as good, while Syrian was associated with darker qualities, some even saying she was the messenger of the underworld. Because of this, Syrian became considered the harbinger of death. Adlet, originating in Inuit mythology. The two tornits sat by the growing fire, whispering. Stars winked down at them from the clear night sky. "Why are we afraid of these half-men when they are so much smaller than us?" said the bulky giant. "Don't be foolish. You saw how they ripped one of their own kind to pieces and ate him. Besides, we are outnumbered. We should escape while they are asleep with full stomachs," the astute one replied. "You are probably right, but they are fast runners. What if they catch up with our sled? With only 2 legs, they are not as fast as a sled. Besides, their dogs are not faster than our dogs. But we must make sure they cannot follow us. What do you suggest, brother? You harness our dogs, and I will cut their sled lashings." And with that, the 2 torments quietly crept into action. Just as they were about to set off, one of their dogs barked in excitement, and the half-men woke up. With their tails whipping behind them, they jumped into their sleds to pursue the torments, but while their dogs scattered across the snow, the Adlet were left standing on abandoned sleds, and the 2 torments escaped into the night. In ancient Inuit culture, people believed in several different tribes of beings, such as the tornits, giants, oh my goodness, Inuganligat, dwarves, and the Adlet. The Adlet, or the I can't say that word, I'm sorry, as they were also known, were a race of dogmen with a human upper body and the 2 legs and tail of a dog or wolf. Adlets were said to be taller than Inuits, but not really as tall as the tornits. Adlets were very swift runners and possessed an aggressive disposition. In some stories, the Adlets are cannibalistic, eating their own kind in addition to being savage and murderous towards other tribes and races. A confrontation with the Adlet always resulted in a fierce battle, but despite their apparent physical superiority, the Inuit always overcame them. These stories highlight desirable qualities valued in Inuit society, such as physical strength, outsmarting opponents, and teamwork. The following is a widespread tale of great antiquity with variations found throughout Greenland, Labrador, and Hudson Bay. It is sometimes known as the Girl and the Dogs. Nivira Siang lived with her father. I'm just going to call her Nivea, because I'm not going to be able to pronounce that multiple times in a row. Lived with her father, but she refused to marry, until one day she married a dog, Ijirunk. Ijirunk was a very unusual dog. He was spotted and had an enthralling gaze. Soon Nivea and Ijirunk had 10 children. 5 were dog pups and 5 were Adler pups, with the top half human and the lower half of the dog. Ijirunk did not hunt, so it fell to Nivea's father, Sevirkon, to provide meat for the loud and clamorous family. I'm going to call him Severe, because, yet again, I'm going to mess it up. One day, Severe had enough, and he rode them all out to a barren island and left them there. He promised he would still hunt for them, and Ijirunk and the unusual dog could swim across to collect the meat. Each time, Ijirunk would swim back with the sealskin sacks filled with meat draped across his body. But Ijirunk came every day wanting more and more meat, for the children had voracious appetites, and his father-in-law eventually tired of this. One day, instead of meat, Severe filled the sealskin sacks with rocks, and Ijirunk drowned before he could reach the island. When Ijirunk's wife, Nivea, found out what had happened, she sought revenge against her father. She sent her 10 children to attack him, but they were unsuccessful and returned to the island, afraid. Their mother, Nivea, decided they must be sent away for their own safety. She took off the sole of her shoe and set it upon the water. As she did so, it grew into a boat large enough for 5 passengers. Nivea sent her 5 dog pups away in the boat. and she told her 5 Adler to flee inland, where their grandfather could not find them. Now alone on the island, Nivea perished from hunger. Often a more recent version of the story is presented presented as an origin story of different peoples because the word Adlet, or Erkidlet, was used by some Inuit communities to describe inland tribes of Native Americans. Additionally, the word for Europeans, GG, was similar to the term for the dog children, Quainblulet, or something like that. I really should look up these pronunciations before I start reading. I'm sorry, guys. However, this must be a later adaptation because versions of the story predate Inuit encounters with Europeans. It is more likely that an existing tale was adapted to explain the existence of European visitors. The name of the unusual dog, Ijirek, means the powerful eye, which explains how he conquered Nivea with a glance when she refused all other suitors. Some accounts consider Ijirek to be the personification of the wolf, and I can't pronounce that word, can be taken to mean wolf. This would make the Adlet children half wolf instead of half dog, which seems a more suitable explanation for their savage reputation. If Adlet had canine upper bodies and human legs, they would readily symbolize a fierce predator, but they do not. The Adlet have a human upper body and canine lower body, so instead they represent the beastly man. Their very nature highlights what makes us human, as it strongly points to the Inuit cultural values of working together, being innovative. I got the word out, I'm so sorry. And resourceful, looking out for each other. And that is why the Inuit always beat the Adlet. Kiyohime, originating in Japanese folklore. The senior priest had a dream, only it wasn't quite a dream. Neither was it reality, but an apparition in between. In his vision, 2 serpents appeared to him. One described himself as a young monk from the Temple Bell, reborn as a snake, and the other was his killer. The monk snake told the senior priest that the actions of the vengeful serpent had bound them together in their next lives. If the senior priest would kindly transcribe the Lotus Sutra and dedicate it to him, it would free him from the cycle of suffering with this lustful creature. The snake monk was sure the sutra would enable him to attain enlightenment and be delivered from suffering. The senior priest did as entreated. He copied the Lotus Sutra, held a dedicated ceremony, and everyone at the temple prayed reverently. Shortly after this, the senior priest dreamed of two beings again, but they were wearing beautiful white robes and were no longer snakes. They spoke to him and thanked him for freeing them. Due to the Lotus Sutra, they had both left their serpentine bodies behind and now could be reborn in separate heavens, their fates no longer entwined. The 2 figures parted from each other and faded away into the heavens. The senior priest awoke with a profound feeling of peace and once settled down to reread the Lotus Sutra. He was sure it would protect him from the attentions of lustful women like the passionate Kiyohime serpent. Kiyohime is a fire-breathing serpent in a well-known Japanese folktale. With a long, twisted body topped with spikes, she was coated in green and red scales. Her hideous face, surrounded by a green mane, comprised of 2 bulging eyes and a single antler-type horn between her animal ears. The tale of Kiyohime, the woman fueled by desire, who turned into a serpent, really began as a story of Anshin, the young monk, and can be found in folktales from the 11th century onwards. Before the 18th century, Kiyohime was unnamed in these early stories, and her character varied from a widow or wife to other female relatives. However, the underlying themes of the story remained unchanged. As the monk was traveling on a pilgrimage to the grand shrines of Kumano, he stayed over as a guest in someone's home, and as was the custom. The daughter of the household, Kiyohime, was very much taken with the handsome young monk and asked him to stay with her. He declined, but said he would return this way after his pilgrimage and come back for her. She waited in anticipation, but he did not return. When Kiyohime saw some other pilgrims returning from Kumano, she hastened out into the street in her bare feet to ask if they had seen her young monk. They had, but he had gone on a different way back, towards Dojoji Temple. Feeling hurt and betrayed, she raced in that direction and caught up with him on the road. When she accosted him, he said she was mistaken, that it wasn't him she was looking for, and disappeared into the crowd. Ordinarily, Kiyohime would have felt shame, but instead she became enraged and followed after him, gradually taking on some features of a serpent and spitting fire. A ferryman had taken Anchin across the river to Dojoji Temple, but he refused when Kiyohime asked him to take her across. The ferryman told her that the monk Anchin had instructed him not to take her in this boat. Forced to complete her transformation into a serpent, Kiyohime swam across the river, leaving her discarded clothes behind. At the temple, Anchin was hidden under the great bell, but she quickly sniffed him out. She wrapped her body around the bell, let forth a blast of fire, and burned him to death, leaving only charred remains. She then threw herself into the river and drowned. This well-lived folktale represents the conflict between the force of pure and noble spirituality and the force of unbridled desire. It was an integral part of the Kumano pilgrimage to observe abstinence, and the most traditional versions of the tale portray Kiyohime as lascivious, and the monk Anchin, oh goodness, I lost my place, as lascivious, and the monk Anchin as surprised and frightened by her advances. In other versions, he is not so dismissive of her less vulgar attentions. The picture scrolls in Dojojin Temple that illustrate this story paint a sympathetic picture of Kiyohime resigned to wait patiently for Anchin's return. Only after he rejects her does she begin to turn into a serpent and succumbs to the lure of revenge. A recurrent theme in Dojojin's tale is the threat posed by lustful women, because this was a tool used to warn the young male monks of the temptations of breaking their abstinence. The story is also used to highlight the power of the Lotus Sutra as one of the most venerated scripts in Mahayana Buddhism and a source of salvation. Comparing different versions of the folktale, it is unclear who was the most at fault at the outset, Kiyohime or Anchin. But maybe it's not supposed to be clear, and the two intertwined snakes at the end of the picture scroll could indicate this. The overall message seems to be that people should beware of excessive passion, reflect on their behavior, and always measure their words carefully. Lungma, origin, Chinese mythology. He knew what people said about him, and benevolent life-giver was his favorite. Unpredictable and destructive, he was not so fond of. And he thought greedy was plain uncalled for, but the god of the Yellow River accepted that he had gotten a little carried away this time. With the autumn rains, his many tributaries had added generously to his boisterous currents. He had voraciously swallowed up the land, and it was difficult to see where the river turned into floodplain. It filled him with joy, all this magnificent great charging water, but his delight was tempered by the misery of the people whose lands and homes had flooded. The river was so wide in places that, looking across from the opposite bank, they could not tell the difference between horse and cow. The people just needed to get organized, and the god of the Yellow River thought a few pointers should be sufficient. So he made a document, a fabulous map etched into a jade tablet, including instructions on how to control the flooding. He wanted well-directed ditches, not trinkets and equine sacrifices. When the people had implemented his designs, he wouldn't have to worry about enjoying the rains, and people would refer to him respectfully again. Calling his faithful dragon horse to him, the god of the Yellow River fastened the jade tablet onto its scaled back as it nudged him affectionately with its whispery face. It was adept at finding worthy individuals to deliver sacred objects to, and he admired it fondly as it swam off into the current. Longma, the dragon horse, always knew just what to do. Putting two together, I think the name Kiyohime means Hime means princess. I don't know what Kiyo means, if I'm being honest with you. But I also didn't look it up. Longma literally translates to dragon horse, and is also a term used for a wise and eminent person. This is particularly relevant because Longma was considered a symbol of virtuous leadership. In ancient China, horses up to a certain height were called ma, but the tallest of the horses were called long, or dragons. Horses were said to be related to dragons, and as such, had both a strong association with water, particularly rivers. Dwelling within the Yellow River, Longma had the shape of a horse but was covered all over in blue and red scales. It had oriental dragon facial features such as whiskers, pointed teeth, and a short horn protruding from the top of its head. Although Longma is occasionally depicted with the dragon's tail, it is more usually a swirling horse's tail. Longma had an upward flowing mane like a dragon and a melodious neigh like the sound of a flute. Some accounts also give Longma feathery wings of various sizes, but with or without wings, Longma could travel in the water or sail through the air, covering hundreds of miles with ease. Longma could also walk on water if it chose to, without its hooves breaking the surface. Longma was considered a good omen and appeared only during the reign of an honorable ruler. Emperor Yao had been on the throne for 70 years and felt it was time to resign and that Shun would make a great predecessor. Thanks to Shun, the floodwaters had been assuaged, and Emperor Yao would be eternally grateful. But he needed divine approval, so Emperor Yao had prepared a ceremony on the banks of the Yellow River. The shrine was built, the wise men consulted, and now they waited for the time between light and dark. As twilight approached, the river began to shine, and a beautifully swirling mist rose from the water, caught by the breeze. From out of the water stepped a horse dragon, blessing them with its presence. It carried green-scaled body armor in its mouth, shaped like the broad shell of a tortoise and striped with dark red. The dragon horse walked majestically up to the shrine, gently placed the armor upon it, and then walked away, disappearing back into the river. When Emperor Yao approached the armor, he saw a message coated in yellow gold, encrusted with white and green gems, and tied with a green thread. When he opened it, he saw that his heart's desire had been given the blessing of heaven, for it read, "With pleased countenance given to Emperor Shun." Emperor Yao could retire to a worthy successor with divine approval. The ancestors of the traditional population of the Yellow River Valley afforded horses great importance, as they were essential to their nomadic way of life. They even considered horses to be divine, like their close relatives, the dragons. In Chinese mythology, horses represent freedom, strength, and beauty, while the dragon is an auspicious symbol of power and vitality. Combined, the dragon horse symbolizes a strong, vigorous spirit representing freedom and divine blessing. Longma has both horse and dragon features because its mother was a mare and its father was a dragon that resided in the river. When the mare went to the river to bathe, it became pregnant by drinking the river water. Seeing Longma was considered a good omen because it only appeared when a virtuous ruler was on the throne. A sighting foretold the appearance of legendary cultural heroes, the 3 kings and the 5 emperors, such as Emperor Yao and Emperor Shun. Longma is most renowned for delivering the Yellow River map and the mystical trigrams used for divination into the hands of the worthy. Representing freedom, power, and vitality, Longma is a symbol of imperial authority, lending divine approval to its rulers. Okay, last story for this book, and then we can swap to the next one. Melusine. Origin, European folklore. Deep in the woods, Raimundin's horse carried him past the fairy fountain. In a reverie cocooned in his troubles, Raimundin did not notice the woman there, but she noticed him. She stopped his horse and reproved him for not greeting her politely. When she got no response, she was inclined to anger until she saw he was asleep. She tugged his hand to wake him. At first he was shocked and afraid, but she soothed him with kind words. "There is no battle. I am on your side," she said with a warm smile. Feeling reassured, he admired her beauty, and her long golden hair spilled in glowing waves down past her shoulders, and her white dress shimmered in the splashes of dappled light. She really was the fairest woman he had ever seen, and he dismounted and begged her for forgiveness. Time passed, and he asked her to marry him. She accepted, but only if he promised to grant her a full day and night of privacy each week. He agreed, but one day he would break his vow and live to regret it, discovering his loving wife, Melusine, was not quite a woman after all. Melusine was the guardian fairy of spring and freshwater sources in ancient Europe. Her mother was the fairy Presina, oh my gosh, and her father was a mortal king, King Elenus of Albany, present-day Scotland. When Melusine sought to punish her father for perceived wrongdoing, Presina reprimanded her with a curse that would transform her into a hybrid creature every Saturday. Based on earlier oral folk tales, the oldest stories gave Melusine a serpent tail and other dragon-like features such as 2 feet and wings. Later adaptations embellished Melusine's tail as blue-glazed and covered with round silver speckles. There was also a distinct shift in iconography from the serpentine tail to a mermaid's fish-like tail. This was due to her strong associations with water, through springs and bathing, but also served to make her appearance less gruesome and more appealing. She was sometimes depicted with 2 fish tails, and some consider her to be the motif behind the 2-tailed siren of the ubiquitous Starbucks logo. Translations of Jean de Arres's tale of Melusine from 1478 highlight the suffering and heartbreak caused by broken promises and lost trust. Raymondin and Melusine had been married for many years. They had 9 sons, and their domain was peaceful and prosperous, and agriculture flourished. Raymondin still didn't know why his wife needed a whole day of privacy on Saturday, and spent most of the day in the bath. He had buried his curiosity years ago, but his brother had recently turned it into jealousy by suggesting that Melusine was with another man every week. On hearing this accusation, Raymondin was filled with suspicion and rushed to the bathing room. He made a small hole in the door with his sword and peeped through. Inside the long marble bath was his wife, but from the navel down her body was a great serpent, as thick as a barrel. He was filled with sorrow, not because her monstrous transformation, but because she was alone, and he had let the provoking words of his brother get the better of him. He filled the hole in the door with black so no one else would see, but he had broken his vow to his wife, and now he would lose her. He wept for the entire night. In the morning his wife returned, and seeing his distress, asked him what was wrong. Raymondin replied that he had had a fever, but felt better now that she was there. She silently forgave him his trespass, and they both continued as if it had never happened. However, one day, in a fit of anger over an unrelated matter, Raymondin called Melusine a false serpent, and their children specters. He immediately regretted it, but the damage was done, and Melusine's secret was revealed. With a heavy heart, Melusine explained that she was not permitted to stay with him now, and was condemned to a life of suffering. They embraced each other, filled with sadness at the loss of their best friend and spouse. Melusine's parting words to him were advice on the domain and their children. With a painful sigh, she transformed into a tremendous long serpent, left her 2-clawed footprints on the stone windowsill, and flew off into the sky. Her sad cries circled around the palace, and then she disappeared. Melusine's heartbroken cries can still be heard in the wails of the wind. Melusine was a hybrid in more ways than one. Despite her serpent or Piscean transformations, she was of mixed fairy and human birth. In addition, she combined what she was, at the time, seen as indistinct feminine and masculine roles. She was both a loving matriarch and wielded authority in the domain, building castles and overseeing agricultural practices for the benefit of all. Her stories had raised questions about power and gender, as well as the damage that can be done by words spoken in anger and the act of breaking vows made in good faith. Okay, I don't know how many stories that was. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There's 12. Well, that's 2 books down. Should we start with seas and rivers or forests and woodlands? And I'm also going to take a drink because I'm a little bit thirsty. Okay, forests and woodlands it is. This book is a little bit tight bound, but that's okay. Snow White and Rose Red. Okay, I'll take another drink. I mean, I asked for an opinion, so of course I'm going to take the opinion into account. Fairy tales are often stories of shape-shifting through enchantment. In such tales, a person's humanity is taken away as punishment for some transgression or perceived wrongdoing, and only a base wild animal is left. The reward in these stories is to regain humanity and dignity. It seems that these tales teach that we become wild animals when our humanity is taken away. men are nothing more than the ferocious bear, and the force of pure brute strength, a wild and tamed power. Yet once we look below the surface, the bears in these tales are so much more, and the true protective aspect of the wilds can be seen, if we choose to look for it. The German folktale Snow White and Rose Red, Schneeweiß und Rosenrot, oh my god, I can't even speak my own language, collected by the Grimm brothers in the 19th century, is just such a tale of transformation. Once there were two girls, Snow White and Rose Red, each with a rose bush that grew outside their cottage in the forest. One with buds, white like snow, and the other with the reddest of petals. One night there was a heavy knocking on the door. They opened it to find a bear. They welcomed him into the home, letting him warm himself by the fire. After that, the bear would come knocking at the door each night. They became the best of friends, and the children played with him every day. Yet one night, the bear announced that he would leave them for a while and go into the forest to protect his treasure from those who would steal it. With sadness, the girls let him go. One day, collecting firewood in the forest, the children came upon a dwarf, hopping mad with anger, his beard caught in a crevice in a fallen tree. When the girls went to help, he did nothing but insult them, yet still they pulled and tugged at his beard, trying to free the angry dwarf. It would not budge. Eventually, the girls pulled out some scissors and chopped off the end of his beard, freeing him at once. Yet the dwarf did nothing but grumble, slung his bag of gold over his back, and flounced off. Later, they saw the same dwarf fishing on the banks of the stream, with his beard wound tightly in his fishing line, with a large fish attached to the other end. There was nothing for the girls to do but chop a little more from the end of his beard, and once more the dwarf had nothing for them but anger and promptly disappeared once more, taking his pearl-filled sack along with him. Soon after, the girls went into town for needles and thread. They came upon a rock-strewn heap with an eagle flying above, which came down to settle in front of them, and yes, indeed, the eagle had seized the very same dwarf. The girls grabbed the dwarf's coat, pulling and pulling so that the eagle could do nothing but release him. At this, he grabbed his bag of sparkling jewels and stormed off. The girls went off to town, yet on their return they came across the dwarf again as he sat admiring his jewels with them spread out before him. Suddenly, a huge brown bear came lolloping towards them all. The dwarf was horrified, yelling and shouting at the bear to leave him be and to take the horrid girls and eat them up instead. The bear, however, swiped at the little man with his great paw, and the dwarf was killed. The two girls began to run away, but as they did, the bear called to them, demanding that they stop and wait. Yet this was not the voice of any old bear, but the voice of their old friend. They had watched as great bearskin fell to the ground, revealing a young man dressed in all shining gold. He told them of his true identity, a prince whose treasure had been stolen by the dwarf, and had been cursed to take on the form of a great bear and roam the forest until the deceitful dwarf was dead. Snow White became his bride, and Rose Red his sister-in-law, and the treasure was shared between them. Callisto, the Star Bear. A bear tale of female enchantment is a story of Callisto, a nymph who had taken an oath of chastity to follow Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, wilderness, and the animals of the wild. While accounts differ, one version says she was raped by Zeus, who tricked her by disguising himself as Artemis. The girl became pregnant and was soon relegated from the group of virginal women she belonged with. It is at this point that this becomes a tale of transformation. In anger, the goddess Hera, Zeus's wife, turned the blameless Callisto into a bear. With fate ever against the girl, her son, Arcas, was hunting in the woodlands one day and almost killed his mother in bear form, only escaping this matricidal fate because Zeus intervened. Filled with pity for the woman, he elicited another transformation. Callisto the bear was replaced in the heavens as a constellation of stars to watch over humanity from the night sky for eternity. In some stories, her son was placed there alongside her, and they can be seen in the sky as Ursa Major and Minor, even today on cloudless nights. Something that becomes clear after reading the story of the woodland creatures, and many similar tales, is that men and women are often shown as opposites in forest folklore, as binary stereotypes in opposition to each other. Men are pure brute strength, while women often flee as damsels in distress. Today, we are moving past these ideas, and now neither men nor women must live up to such outdated stereotypes of myths and fairy tales. Yet do not be deceived. In the woodlands and forests, nothing is ever what it seems. As we will find out as we continue our journey into the leaves. The tricksy, shifting nature of the trees contains a seed of hope for those who themselves wish to morph and change, fitting neither of these molds or breaking them entirely. We can dig deep into these woodland tales for a splinter of wisdom rooted beneath the surface. With the ease of men and women to morph into bears and wolves of the forest, we too can transform by entering the realm of the wild and choosing our own form, just like the creatures in these stories. We can rewrite these fairy tales for a modern generation, for our own selves, as many authors like Angela Carter have done. In the years to come, we will continue to do so, and they will remain with us, themselves morphing, changing, and shape-shifting in form just like the creatures within them. So that was just a little thing on bears. Next one, Bloody Mary, the Legend of Mary Worth. There are some names that generate terror at their very mention. Bloody Mary is one such name, striking fear into the hearts of teenage girls across the United States and the United Kingdom for several generations. Are you brave enough to follow the footsteps of countless teens that have gone before? If so, stand before a mirror in a darkened bathroom and call on the name of Bloody Mary. As you wait, watch the mirror carefully for her to appear. But beware, you might live to regret your actions if you are lucky, for Mary knows no mercy. The urban legend of Bloody Mary and the ritual game that is attached to it has been well entrenched in the folklore of the US and UK since at least the 1970s, in countless variations across geographical location and time. Some link her to Mary Tudor, the English queen known as Bloody Mary due to her persecution of Protestants during her 16th century reign. Others say she is a ghost of a young woman who never made it to her dance or prom. Whatever the identity behind the apparition, she is said to be vengeful and after blood. Although largely an oral legend, relying on being passed from group to group and generation to generation by word of mouth, it is tangible evidence that the legend is hugely popular, as only a brief glimpse on the internet will show you. There are YouTube videos purporting to show the ritual, if you are brave enough to watch, and various sites outlining various legends behind Mary's fate. The first in-depth study into the legend and rituals associated with it was carried out by Janet Langlois and published in 1978. Interviewing school children from Indianapolis, Indiana, Langlois learned that the ritual was often attached to a variation of the Phantom Hitchhiker legend, with Mary having been killed on the way variously to or from a dance, party, or date. Unbeknown to the passing driver, they pick up Mary from the side of the road and take her to the house she tells them to go to, only to discover the real Mary's true fate from her remaining family. Back in the car, there is nothing left of Mary but a puddle in the back seat. According to the children Langlois interviewed, it was supposedly this Mary that appears in the mirror when called, inflicting harm on those who have summoned her. Langlois' interviewees also identified several different names that were attached to the Mary legend. One was Mary Worth or Worthington. It is a Mary of this name who likewise features in one of the more recent incarnations of the Mary legend prevalent on the internet. According to this modern version, Mary Worth made her home in a woodland cottage, where she eked out an existence peddling her herbal remedies to those who sought her out. She was greatly feared as a witch who could cause much mischief if she disliked you, harming animals and children and ruining the harvest. People of the town were very careful not to anger Mary. It seemed, though, that it had done no good. Young girls started to go missing, never to be seen again, and at the same time, Mary, once old and wrinkled, was looking more youthful by the day. Where was the connection? Some thought so, but dared to do no more than whisper the fact. There was no proof, after all, that Mary had done anything wrong. One night, the miller's wife was sitting nursing a toothache, unable to sleep. It was lucky that she was, as it was thus that she witnessed her daughter leave the house as if in a trance, following the sound only she could hear. Both the miller and his wife followed the girl, their attempts to turn her back towards home fruitless. The good people of the town ran to their aid. A farmer spotted a bright light at the edge of the forest, and who do you think was there? Mary herself, glowing with a diabolical light and pointing a wand at the Miller house. The quick-thinking farmer shot at Mary, his gun filled with bullets made of silver in case of such an eventuality. Mary fell and the crowd was upon her. She was taken to a field where the angry townsfolk tied her to a stake and burnt her on a bonfire. Mary did not go quietly. Burning, she let her ire be known, cursing those who had brought about her destruction. If anyone from then on said her name, when standing in front of a mirror, her spirit would come forth once more, exacting vengeance for the death meted out to her. There was no doubt that they had found the right person. After they were certain she was no more, they returned to her cottage. There they found the terrible sight of graves of the girls who had gone missing. So beware of uttering the name Bloody Mary before a mirror, for the spirit of the witch has not forgotten or forgiven. She will return, tearing you to shreds and stealing your soul, which will burn for all eternity trapped in the mirror forevermore. In some tellings of this version of the Mary Worth tale, she is very beautiful, and it was jealousy of this that led the people to shunning her and getting her revenge. In others, she was old, using the blood of young girls to reverse the aging process. In another, when she was discovered to have had a child out of wedlock, she was forced to watch the child killed, and then had her own face cut by her fellow villagers, forced to watch in a mirror while they did so. Witches living in the woods and forest are well known, with Baba Yaga and the witch with the gingerbread cottage of Hansel and Gretel famed, just two such examples. It is hardly surprising, therefore, to find witch and wood motifs finding a place in modern permutations of urban legends. Was there ever a real Mary Worth? It goes without saying that there is no record of Mary Worth in Salem trials, executed or otherwise. The fact that she is said to have been burnt is also a major red flag for the veracity of the tale, as convicted witches in both America and England were hanged, not burned. Although the location and time that Mary is said to have met her fate is usually unspecified or kept deliberately vague, in one intriguing version she is named as Mary Bloodsworth, buried in 1741 in a grave up the hill behind Boston Latin School in Boston, Massachusetts. Although a cursory look through the records for the surrounding cemeteries does not reveal anyone of that name, the addition of such details to the story acts to strengthen and ensure the continuation of her legend. A Mary Worth is also linked to Oak Grove Cemetery in Whitewater, southern Wisconsin, known as the Second Salem. It was here that Mary, a convicted witch, as the story goes, insisted she be buried, or else she would curse the town. There is no doubt that people wholeheartedly believed they have seen something when summoning Mary, and it is fear generated in such situations that allow the legend to live on. Scientific explanations for what people say they have seen in the mirror include a strange face illusion, where the brain's facial recognition ability malfunctions, Troxler's fading, or self-hypnosis. Why not go and read about Mary on the internet? Or you could gather a group of friends together on a dark night and try one of the many variations that are available, if you dare. And since that story mentioned Baba Yaga, Bolt sent me a link to another story that technically follows along with this. So forgot to pull it up on my phone ahead of time, but I have it now. Okay. Once upon a time, an old man lived in the hut with his little girl Natasha. So happy they were. At tea time, they would play peekaboo behind a samovar, a very tall teapot. They would drink tea with honey bread and strawberry jam. Everything was fine. The only sad times were when the old man remembered how much he missed having a wife by his side and a mother for Natasha. One day, the man met a woman he liked a lot, and before long, they were married. At first, Natasha was glad to have a stepmother to look after her, but not for long. The stepmother started all kinds of strict new rules. Natasha wasn't allowed to play games like peekaboo anymore with her father. She wasn't allowed to have other girls over for tea. Her stepmother said that little girls shouldn't have tea at all, much less eating bread with jam. All Natasha got for dinner was one small crust of bread, and she must leave the hut to eat it. Poor Natasha. She would run into the backyard and into the shed to hide. She would wipe the small crust with her tears and eat it all alone. Then, the stepmother would yell that she must come back to the house right away. The dishes from dinner needed washing, and the floor must be swept clean until it's shown. Yet something else was worse than all of this. Each night, the stepmother sat with Natasha's father and told him that everything that went wrong in the house was his daughter's fault. Sadly, the old man believed his new wife. One day, the stepmother decided she could not stand the sight of Natasha one more day. How could she get rid of the girl once and for all? The stepmother remembered her sister, the terrible witch Baba Yaga, who lived in the forest. I know how to get rid of the brat for good, the stepmother said to herself with a smile. As soon as he was out of sight, the wicked stepmother spun around to Natasha. Listen to me, she hissed. Today you will go visit my sister, your dear little auntie who lives in the forest. You will ask her for a needle and thread. We need it to mend this shirt. But, said Natasha, holding up a needle and thread for her stepmother to see. We already have a needle and thread. She knew about her aunt who lived in the forest. She was none other than the terrible witch Baba Yaga, the one who chased little children by riding through the air on her giant broom. Which, honestly, this story is incorrect. Baba Yaga rode in a mortar and pestle, by the way. Incorrect. Anywho, riding through the air on her giant broom. And when she caught them, she would eat them with her iron teeth. Who asked you? Snapped the stepmother, knocking the needle and thread out of the girl's hand. Shaking with fear, Natasha said, Well, how do I find my auntie? That's better, said the stepmother with a crooked smile. She twisted the little girl's nose, pinching it hard. That is your nose, she said. Can you feel it? Yes, whispered the poor girl. You must go along the road into the forest until you come upon a fallen tree. Then turn left, said the stepmother. Follow your nose, it will take you to your auntie. Now off with you, you lazy girl. The stepmother shoved a small sack in the girl's hands that had a few morsels of stale bread and cheese and some scraps of meat, and pushed Natasha out of the hut. Natasha looked back. Her stepmother stood in the front door with her arms crossed, glaring. The girl walked along the road to the forest, and then to the fallen tree, and then she turned left. Her nose started to throb harder as she knew she was going the right way. Then, all of a sudden, in front of her, behind an old gate stood the hut of Baba Yaga. There could be no... Okay, this is a really incorrect story. Baba Yaga lived in a house that walked around on chicken legs. Which is strange, I know. Oh well, we're gonna read it anyway. There could be no mistake. Only the hut of Baba Yaga, okay, never mind. I should have read farther. My bad. Only the hut of Baba Yaga, the witch, stood high up on chicken legs, and could walk around the yard by itself. When it turned to face you, the front windows looked like two eyes, and the door looked like a mouth. And it's not said to be a house that stood still. It would, like, roam the forest. But it's okay. We are part of the way into the story. The two gate doors in the fence were open. When Natasha pushed them a bit to go through, they made a terrible squeaking sound. On the ground, she noticed a rusty oil can. The girl picked it up. How lucky, she said. There's some oil left. She poured the few drops left onto the hinges of the gate. Both gate doors swung open without a peep. As Natasha walked closer, Baba Yaga's house turned around on its chicken legs and faced her. Frightened as she was, the sound of crying made Natasha turn around. A servant of Baba Yaga's was standing in the yard, crying and wiping her tears on her sleeve. How lucky, said Natasha, that I have a handkerchief. She untied her handkerchief, shook it clean, and carefully put the scraps of food in her pockets. She gave the cloth to Baba Yaga's servant, who wiped her tears with it and smiled. In front of the door to the hut was a huge thin dog chewing on an old bone. How lucky, said the little girl, that I have some bread and meat. Reaching into her pocket for her scraps of bread and meat, Natasha said to the dog, I'm afraid it's rather stale, but it's better than nothing. At once the dog gobbled it up and licked his lips. Natasha finally reached the door to the hut. Trembling, she knocked. Come in, squeaked the wicked voice of Baba Yaga. The little girl stepped in. There sat Baba Yaga the witch, weaving at a loom. She had scraggly white hair, a very long nose, and when she smiled, showed a mouthful of iron teeth. The witch was skinny and bony. Good day to you, auntie, said Natasha, trying to sound not afraid. And good day to you, niece, said Baba Yaga. My stepmother has sent me to you to ask for a needle and thread to mend a shirt. Has she now? Smiled Baba Yaga, flashing her iron teeth, for she knew how much her sister hated Natasha, her stepdaughter. You sit down here at my loom and continue to weave, said Baba Yaga. I will go fetch you that needle and thread. So the little girl sat down at the loom and began to weave. Baba Yaga whispered to her servant, Listen to me, go to the bathhouse, start up the fire for the bathwater, it must be very hot. Yes, said the servant girl, and she left to do her task. The servant came into the room where Natasha was weaving to fetch a jug to take water to the bathhouse. Natasha said to her, I beg you please, be slow in making the fire and heating up the water. I need time to think of a plan. The servant girl said nothing, but she took a very long time in getting the bathwater ready. Baba Yaga came to the window and said in her sweetest voice, Are you still weaving, little niece? Are you weaving, my pretty? Yes, I am weaving, auntie, said Natasha. She thought, I've got to get out of here somehow. In a corner of the hut, Natasha noticed a thin black cat watching a mouse hole. "What are you doing?" she said to the black cat. "Watching for a mouse," said the thin black cat. "I haven't had any dinner in 3 days." "How lucky," said Natasha. "I have some cheese left." And she gave the cheese in her pocket to the thin black cat, who gobbled it up. The cat said, "Little girl, do you want to get out of here?" "Of course I do," said Natasha. "I fear that Baba Yaga will try to eat me with her iron teeth." "That is exactly what she will do," said the black cat, "but I know how to help you," whispered the cat. "Do you see the comb on the stool? Do you see the towel?" Natasha nodded. "You must take both of those," said the cat, "and then run for it while Baba Yaga is still in the bathhouse. She will chase after you. When she does, you must throw the towel behind you. It will turn into a big wide river, and it will take her time to cross that river. When she crosses over, throw the comb behind you. It will sprout up into such a thick forest that she will never be able to get through." "But if I leave the loom now to pick up the towel and the comb," said Natasha, she will hear that I have stopped weaving, and then she will be able to catch me before I have even a chance to escape." "Don't worry," said the thin black cat. "I'll take care of that." And then he took Natasha's place at the loom. Clickety-clack, clickety-clack. The loom never stopped for a moment. Natasha looked to see that Baba Yaga was still in the bathhouse. She grabbed the towel and the comb and quickly ran out of the hut. The big dog jumped up to tear her to pieces, but then he saw it was the same girl as before. "Why, this is the girl who gave me that bread and meat," said the dog. "Good luck, child." And then he laid back down, letting her go. When Natasha came to the gate doors, they opened quietly without making a noise, because of the oil she had poured into its hinges. Then how did she run? Meanwhile, the thin black cat sat at the loom. Clickety-clack, clickety-clack, went the loom. Baba Yaga came to the window. "Are you weaving, little niece?" she asked in a high-pitched voice. "Are you weaving, my pretty?" "I am weaving, auntie," said the thin black cat, while the loom went clickety-clack, clickety-clack. "That is not the voice of my dinner," said Baba Yaga. She ran into the hut. At the loom was no little girl, but only the thin black cat. "Grr," said Baba Yaga. She jumped at the cat. "Why didn't you scratch out the little girl's eyes?" The thin black cat replied, "In all the years I have served you, you have given me only water and made me hunt for my dinner. That girl gave me real cheese." "Grr," said Baba Yaga. Grr, Baba Yaga grabbed the cat and shook it hard. Turning to the servant girl and gripping her tightly, she yelled, "Why did you take so long to prepare the bath?" "Ah!" cried the girl. "In all the years I have served you, you have never given me a rag, but that girl gave me a pretty handkerchief." Seeing the gate doors wide open, she shrieked, "Gates, why didn't your doors squeak when she opened you?" "Ah," said the gates, "in all the years that we have served you, you've never so much as sprinkled a drop of oil on us. We could hardly stand the sound of our own creaking, but the girl oiled us, and we can now swing back and forth without a sound." Baba Yaga slammed the gates closed. Spinning around, she pointed her long skinny finger at the dog. "You," she hollered. "Why didn't you tear her to pieces when she ran out of the house?" "Ah," said the dog, "in all the years that I have served you, you never threw me anything but an old bone, but the girl gave me real meat and bread." Baba Yaga rushed about the yard, cursing and hitting all the while screaming at the top of her lungs. Then she jumped onto her broom and flew up into the air. Soon she was closing in on the girl. "You will never escape me," Baba Yaga laughed a terrible laugh. She steered straight downwards towards the girl. Natasha was running faster than she had ever run before. She could hear Baba Yaga getting closer and closer. Then she remembered the thin black cat's words. She threw the towel behind her on the ground. It grew bigger and bigger and became wetter and wetter. Soon a deep wide river stood between the little girl and Baba Yaga. Natasha kept running. Oh, how she ran! When Baba Yaga reached the edge of the river, she screamed louder than ever, for she knew she could not fly over an enchanted river. In a rage, she flew back to her hut. There, she gathered all her cows and drove them to the river. "Drink, drink," she screamed at them. The cows drank up the river to the very last drop. Baba Yaga hopped back onto her broom and flew over the dried-up river to catch Natasha. Natasha had run on quite a distance ahead. In fact, she thought she might, at last, be free of the terrible Baba Yaga, but her heart froze in terror when she saw a dark figure in the sky speeding behind her. "This is the end of me," she cried. Then she remembered what the cat had said about the comb. She threw the comb behind her, and the comb grew bigger and bigger, its teeth sprouting into a thick forest. It was so thick that not even Baba Yaga could force her way through it. Baba Yaga screamed with rage and disappointment, finally turned around and flew back to her hut. The tired girl arrived back home at last. "I am home, but I cannot go inside," she said to herself, thinking of her stepmother. "What will I do?" She waited outside in the shed for her father to come home. When she saw her father pass by, she ran out to him. The stepmother came out to see what the fuss was about. She turned yellow when she saw the girl, and her eyes glowed green, showing her true self. But this time, Natasha was not afraid. She told her father everything that had happened. When the old man learned that his wife had sent his own daughter to be eaten by the witch Baba Yaga, he was so angry that he drove the stepmother out of the hut, never to return. From then on, the father took good care of his daughter, and he never let a stranger come between them. Once again, the table was piled high with honey bread, strawberry jam, and tea. Father and daughter played their games of peekaboo until it was time to go to bed, and so the two of them lived happily ever after. The end. I mean, it's not lore accurate, you're right. But it was, I guess, kind of cute. Very fairy tale-esque. Okay, which means it's on to the next book. I moved this one over to the red pile, so... Okay. It was good for a short story. So the next one that I chose is because of a saying that I've been saying for a really long time, even though I have no real affinity to the sea. I'm sure a lot of people have heard it too. It's red skies at night, sailors delight. Red skies in the morning, sailors take warning. And this specific part of the book touches on that. Sailors' superstitions from across the globe. With the perilous nature of sea voyages, and the uncertainties that prevailed when setting off for waters unknown, it comes as no surprise that numerous superstitions and beliefs have grown up among those who live their lives on the waves. For despite the treacherous nature of the sea, there were many ways an uncanny sailor could guard against misfortune, and even more actions and mistakes needed to be avoided at all costs. Some people were thought to be naturally luckier than others, and protected at sea. Those who were born with a caul, that is, with a portion of tissue or amniotic membrane attached to their head, were said to be safe from death by drowning. Some believed that this immunity only held for that person, while others stated the protection could be transferred. Hence a thriving tradition in preserved cauls right up until the 20th century. One particular tale tells of how a child born with this protection caused no end of trouble to his mother at bath time. However hard she tried, the air-filled buoyancy of his caul meant that she couldn't keep him long enough under the water to be properly washed. To be born in the caul was to be in good company. Among the great and famous reputed to have been born thus are Byron, Freud, James I, and Napoleon. Cicero is often cited as stating that those born at the rising of the dog star, Sirius, that is, the 3rd of July to the 11th of August, were never to be drowned, protected by the accident of their birth. There has been much concern regarding the luck or otherwise of particular days when it comes to setting sail. In England and Scotland, Sundays were seen as a lucky day to do so, and a voyage beginning on that day would go without a hitch. Wednesday and Thursday were likewise lucky according to Norse tradition, being associated with Odin and Thor, respectively, and thus was thought invoking the protection of the god in question. Friday, on the other hand, was considered an unlucky day for sea journeys in many cultures. The obvious and most frequent connection made is that of it being the day of Christ's crucifixion, and it has also been suggested by some that being the day of the Norse goddess Freya, with her association with the much maligned cat, it was therefore unlucky for those at sea. On the other hand, Friday was said to be an auspicious day to start a voyage in America due to many positive events in history of that nation occurring on that day. For the Spanish sailors, Tuesday was a bad day to set sail, as outlined in the proverb El martes ne te casas, ne te embarques, ne de te mujer apartarse? I don't speak Spanish, forgive me. Tuesday, don't marry, go to sea, or leave your wife. Perhaps not surprisingly, the number of things that were seen as lucky at sea were more numerous than those that brought favor. It was well known that having a woman on board a ship was seen as a surefire way to bring bad fortune, both for the ship and no doubt the woman in question. Although, conversely, it has been said that a naked woman actually has the opposite effect and could calm the storm from on deck. Okay, that makes no sense. Making a wine glass ring would cause the death of a sailor, and if the glass actually broke, then any number of disasters could occur. Whistling close to the sea could have perilous consequences, as could anything going wrong during the naming of a ship. Although red sky at night before setting sail could be seen as a positive sign, if it happened come morning, that was another matter entirely, and a sailor should beware of what might be about to befall him. Cats were said to be used by witches to cause storms. Forgives but doesn't forget. Listen! You try reading for 3 hours straight and not messing up stuff that isn't your native tongue. I will fight you. I will drive there and I will fight you. Anyway. Cats were said to be used by witches to cause storms that put the crews of ships in peril, while in Zoroastrian folklore, cats are thought to have been created when a woman copulated with a demon. And this is believed, and it is believed that all fish will die if a cat dares to urinate in the water. Yep. Can I have tickets to that fight? I don't think Epi would fight me. I think he would just concede and or hug me to keep my arms down. Plus, I wouldn't fight anyway. Oh wow, I don't think I picked enough. We still have 2 stories in this book, 2 stories in another book, and then I also downloaded Sleepy Hollow, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So let's see how far that brings us. Sinister Bog Lights, Will-o'-the-Wisp. The road is long and the traveler weary. Did I say that word right? Weary? Weary. Okay, apparently I have a lisp. Though he is not yet near his destination, suddenly in the distance he spots a light, glowing and beckoning, urging him to follow. Thinking it might be a shortcut, some kind of soul showing him the way, he steps from the path, deciding it is worth the risk. It is a choice that he might well live to regret, if he is lucky, as the traveler ventures onto the increasingly marshy land. The solid ground he has left so rashly no longer visible. The light is the only thing that he can identify for certain in the gloom. Still optimistic, he continues on, and on, growing wearier with each moment. Suddenly, without warning, the light goes out, just as the traveler feels his foot sink into the water. That water has posed a danger to travelers across the millennia is indisputable. I lost my place. That water has posed a danger to travelers across the millennia is indisputable. This very fact is made glaringly apparent by the large number of legends focused on this most treacherous of nature's elements. Ignis Fatuus, Fool's Fire, exists in many variations in folklore across the world. Witnessed especially over swamps, marshes, and bogs, these atmospheric lights are particularly prevalent across Europe, Norway, and areas of the USA. Presenting in varying hues and sizes, these lights are frequently said to lure travelers to a watery fate, or, at best, leave them hopelessly lost. In England, the common name for such lights is will-o'-the-wisp, derived from wisp, the 17th century word meaning a bundle of hay or straw, and is often said to be someone called Will holding a lighted torch. Will's American counterpart is jack-o'-lantern, and both are frequently depicted as having malicious or mischievous intent, and these lights are often referred to as spook lights, orbs, or ghost lights. Within European folklore, there are many explanations for these intriguing lights. Some say they are linked to fairies. Others believe a man named Jack or Will, doomed to haunt the watery marshlands for all eternity due to some terrible deed committed during his life, is a source of the lights that bob and dance in the distance. According to Swedish folklore, the lights are the souls of those who have died unbaptized. Ever hopeful, they lead travelers to the water in the hope that they themselves can receive the sacrament of baptism that they missed in life. The Bengali phenomenon Alaya, marsh ghost light, appears to fishermen, causing confusion and leading them to become lost, sometimes forever, drowned in the marshes. Traditions in West Bengal and Bangladesh hold that the lights are ghosts of fishermen who lost their lives at their work. They are not always intent on harm, however, some actually leading people away from danger to escape the fate they met themselves. The Hestelin of Norway, Martha lights of Texas, and the Hobby Lantern of Europe, to name a few, known by different names in different places, The description of these ghostly lights are intriguingly similar, descriptions across time and place being startlingly consistent. In the Scottish Highlands, the ghostly lights, known as spunky, are common around lochs and have more human form. Resembling a link boy, children who would illuminate the way for pedestrians with a lighted torch, the spunky was well known for leading those who follow him to a deadly end. There was no end to the mischief caused by this manifestation, also causing ships to be wrecked by luring them onto the rocks, thinking it to be the light of the harbor. In the West Country of England, in Cornwall and Devon, such spirits are known as pixie light. They are responsible for luring travelers into the dangerous bogs of the area. The swamp-ridden Massachusetts Bridgewater Triangle in the USA has a history of sightings of ghostly lights. They are not just a historic occurrence, however. Modern sightings are equally plentiful. Scientific theories to explain these lights have abounded since at least the 16th century, when the lights were attributed to the decay of organic matter. Today, the accepted explanation is the lights are caused by the oxidation of phosphine, diphosphine, and methane. Why can I say words of components, but I can't say simple words? Anyway, there is also considerable lore that the lights mark the location of treasure. In Finland, St. John's Day was a time to look, as the lights would reveal the location of the riches hidden by others. Lastly in this book is a rather important figure in Arthurian literature and lore, the Lady of the Lake. Arthur, that valiant king, noble warrior, had been lucky to escape his last battle with his life. Merlin had put his foe, the tallest knight in the entire land, to an enchanted sleep, and had taken Arthur to have his wounds healed by a skilled hermit. Now physically recovered, the king rode onwards with the wily sorcerer, lamenting his lack of a sword. "Have patience," Merlin cautioned, and he was again proved right. As they approached a large lake, an intriguing sight caught Arthur's eye. Out of the glistening water was a mysterious arm, holding aloft a beautiful sword. "Who is that?" Arthur demanded. "The Lady of the Lake," Merlin responded. "If you wish for the sword to be yours, you must ask her for it. Be sure, however, to do so courteously." As if sensing his intent, the beautiful woman was gliding towards him over the water, and, as she approached, Arthur seized his chance. Who does the sword belong to?" he asked, adding that he had lost his own weapon in battle. "It is mine," she replied, "but I will give it to you in return for something I will ask you for." Arthur agreed, and duly followed her instructions to enter the nearby barge, rowing it towards the sword. He took it with him, not forgetting her injunction to make sure not to leave the scabbard behind. It was the scabbard, Merlin later told him, that was the most important, as he would never be injured whilst wearing it. Vivian, Nimue, and Niveen, whichever of the various names she is known by, the Lady of the Lake is inextricably connected with the most famous legend of English kings, Arthur. Credited with giving the great warrior his famed sword Excalibur, she has exerted a pull on the imaginations of artists, poets, and authors across the centuries, and remains a vital character in the retellings of the Arthurian tales. Aside from her pivotal role in Arthur's destiny, the Lady of the Lake has strong connections to two other prominent figures. According to some tellings, she enchanted Merlin, first by her physical beauty, and then, making it a condition of her capitulation, by the very magic she persuaded him to teach her. Utterly taken with her, Merlin wanted her for his own. The lady, however, had other ideas. She would only acquiesce if Merlin first taught her everything he knew, in effect making her as powerful as he was himself. The smitten sorcerer agreed, despite seeing only too well the fate that would befall him: eternal imprisonment in a cave or a tree. The other important role played by this mysterious lady is the fairy or foster mother figure to Lancelot. Chrétien de Troyes, creator of this favorite knight, has him raised by a fairy in the lake. There is, however, potentially an even older German version with Lancelot raised on an island of thousands of happy maidens after being taken away by a merfian or water fairy. Just who was she? Some sources conflate her with Morgan Le Fay, Arthur's sister, while another idea is that she was a third child to Uther Pendragon, his sister to Arthur and Morgan. There is some argument that she was literally created from Merlin. In that subtle blend and development of language, the Welsh, Wimleyan? Kilfleyan? I don't know, meaning pale-faced wanderer, is said to have been corrupted into Vivian in the French telling of Arthur and his knights, originally meaning Merlin himself. This morphed into a fair maiden, and over time, the mysterious ethereal lady who entrapped Merlin was born and adopted into Arthurian canon. Okay. Next book. Of giants, warriors, kings, and heroes. Some of the earliest humans may have arrived in the British Isles as long ago as 800,000 years ago, at the beginning of the Paleolithic period, the Stone Age, when people first started to make stone tools like those at Hapsburg in Norfolk, the earliest found in Britain. Later, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers began to make the slow transition from moving around the landscape to settled rural life. In museums, we can see hand axes that these early humans left behind, and in ancient rock art, such as the Crespo Crags in Derbyshire. The imagination of people in the mysterious past reaches out to touch our very own time. Legends and myths abound as to early human habitations. Some stories imagine that ancient Britain was first inhabited by giants who roamed the land. These myths are perhaps celebrated in gigantic figures carved into the chalk cliffside, such as the Long Man of Wilmington in East Sussex and the Cerne Abbas giant in Dorset. Although their origins are unclear, folklore says that the Cerne giant may in fact be the outline of the corpse of a real giant, others adding that the outline of the Danish giant who was drawn around and beheaded by the locals as he slept. One of the most famous British giants features in an old legend of the founding of London, linked with Welsh and Cornish traditions, and related by Geoffrey of Monmouth in his Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain, in the 12th century. This tale tells how after the fall of Troy, a band of Trojans fled to the seas, led by Brutus. After many adventures, they finally arrive on the shores of Albion, now Britain, which had been inhabited by a race of brutal cannibalistic giants. Gog-Magog was their fierce leader, and now the only one left of their ancient race. One of the Trojans, Corneus, fought the great giant in single-handed combat, which led to Gog-Magog being thrown from a cliff to meet his doom. The end of the tale is murky, and it's unclear whether the giant died or was taken captive. At this point, the story shifts to how the city of Troyonot, or New Troy, now the city of London, was founded by Brutus and his crew. Brutus supposedly chose to erect his great palace where the Guildhall now stands. The London Stone is a well-known London landmark that is usually situated by Cannon Street, though currently housed at the London Museum. Its origins are disputed, but it is certainly a relic of an ancient building that may date from Roman times or even earlier. 2 statues now stand in the Guildhall to commemorate this tale. Some say that one is the giant Gog-Magog, and the other is his captor, Corneus, while many simply call the statues Gog and Magog, 2 giants of legend mentioned in the Bible. The Gog-Magog Hills, southeast of Cambridge, are also named for them. The original statues, recorded as appearing at the coronation of Queen Elizabeth I in 1559, were remade in the 18th century, yet these replicas were destroyed during an air raid in the Second World War. Remade once more, the giants have regularly taken part in the Lord Mayor's Show, held in November each year. Jack the Giant Killer is an infamous figure in Cornish folklore, said to have killed the giant Cormoran, who built the castle on St. Michael's Mount. The story goes that the giant was famous for terrorizing the local people, and as a reward, was offered to whoever could rid them of the scourge. A young boy named Jack decided to try his luck, and one morning dug a hole in the side of the mount, after which he awoke the giant by blowing his horn loudly. Blinded by the bright sun, the giant stumbled down the mountainside and fell into the hole. Jack filled it in on top of him, becoming a local hero instantly. Even today, when taking up the path to the castle, you will see a heart-shaped stone, which some say is the giant's, and that if you stand upon it, you can still hear the thud, thud of its beating underneath your feet. Another famous British giant is Ysbydden, from the tale Culhwch and Olwen, the Mabinogion, a collection of earliest prose stories in British literature that comprises the White Book of Rhydderch and the Red Book of Hergest. This tale is a classic hero quest where a young man, Culhwch, sets out to find his love, Olwen, the daughter of a giant, after being cursed by his stepmother so that he could love no other. The hero goes to find her, with the help of his cousin Arthur. She agrees to marry him, but her father, Ysbydden, decrees that Culhwch must accomplish a number of other great must accomplish a number of impossible feats before he will be given permission. In the style of other great heroic tales such as Heracles, or Odysseus, Culhwch manages some of these tasks, and yet Ysbydden dies, leaving the couple free to marry. Hi, Super Sage! How are you? Another fearless figure from British and Irish mythology is Finian Mac Cumaill, a hunter warrior who appeared in Scottish and Manx folklore, carried from Irish tradition by settlers from across the Irish Sea and North Channel in many tales. Finian is a fearless leader, while in some stories he himself is a benevolent giant. He is surrounded by tales of great heroic deeds, from killing giants to defeating fearsome serpents, and his story is steeped in magic. Animal transformations play a huge part in his story. When thrown by his grandfather from a cliff, his grandmother took the form of a bird and caught him. His mistress, mother of his son Ossian, was said in some versions to take the form of a deer at night, the result of druidic magic. His sister was transformed into a dog by a jealous lover and later gave birth to 2 hounds, which accompany Finian in his adventures. He was said to be able to transform into animal form by using a magical hood, and was blessed with the powers of invisibility and to raise storms. One of the most famous tales surrounding Finian, the Salmon of Knowledge, comes straight from Irish legend. The salmon's knowledge of all, gained by eating only hazelnuts from a sacred tree, could be passed on to anyone who tastes its flesh. Finian's teacher, the druid and poet Finnegas, had sought the salmon for many years. One day he finally caught it near the River Boyne, and told Finian to cook it for him. Finian burned his thumb while cooking and inadvertently put it into his mouth, tasting the salmon and gaining some of its knowledge. On seeing this, Finnegas told the boy to eat the entire fish, to gain all the knowledge in the world, which he did. From that day forward, Finian would put his thumb in his mouth and evoke the wisdom of the salmon. He is said to lie at Tomnahurich, near Inverness, or on the Isles of Skye, and it is said he is in endless sleep with his band of warriors, the Finnan, only to wake when called to save the country from peril. The legendary Welsh bard Taliesin, originally known as... Oop! Thank you for the follow, Sage. I appreciate it. Originally known as Gwion Bach, son of Gwerin, has a similar story to that of Finian Mac Cumaill and the Salmon of Knowledge. Servant to the great Caradwin, the boy was charged with the stirring of the cauldron of inspiration for a whole year. Once the potion of inspiration was complete, 3 drops of the mixture spilled onto his thumb, which he put into his mouth and thus gained its magical powers. He fled in fear and transformed himself into a piece of grain in order to hide, which Caradwin ate, later giving birth to the boy, who was from that day named Taliesin. Like so many great heroic tales, the legend of King Arthur began with a story that might have had some truths, but was subsequently added to and embellished. Fragments of texts about warriors who drew together the tribal chiefs and petty kings of Britain against the Saxons, after the Romans left, are scattered in old texts. Nennius, the 9th Welsh monk, speaks of him as a great battle commander in his Historia Britonum, and Arthur is shown early on to be a warrior bent on defending Britain from a tide of marauding forces. Gildas, a 6th century British monk, tells that Arthur fought the Saxons in a number of battles culminating into success that led to his reputation at the legendary Battle of Mount Badon. Possible contenders for the site of this semi-mythical battle include Badbury Rings Hill Fort in Dorset and Liddington Castle in Wiltshire, as well as the city of Bath. With each passing age, writers took the legends of Arthur and added their own twists, weaving old tales with new in feats of imagination. For those in the Dark Ages, he was a warrior who would return as a savior of the people in a time of need. Later, he became a medieval symbol of chivalry, yet for the Victorians, his was a story filled with Christian virtues. Arthur's final resting place was also shrouded in mystery, some say so as to not stir the ambitions of the Saxons. One legend tells that he was buried at Glastonbury Abbey, which incidentally is near Cadbury Castle. In the 12th century, monks at the abbey claimed to have unearthed the bones of Arthur and his blonde-haired queen, along with a cross inscribed with his name. More recent research has shown that a grave of the correct type was indeed located in the area the monks claimed. However, there is also strong folk tradition in Britain that imagines King Arthur as a sleeping warrior ready to wake to save the land when needed. This legend places him in many possible locations: Avalon, Richmond Castle in North Yorkshire, Adderley Edge in Cheshire, and at the ruin of Sowingshield Castle in Northumberland. Other notable sleeping kings in Britain include Owain Laga, a Welsh, that's a hard word to say right now, soldier who is said to sleep at Llandeilo in an underground cave illuminated by lanterns until the time when he will awake to become king of the Britons. Another is Owain Glyndwr, a Welsh ruler who led a revolt against the English, who is said to have powers of invisibility using a magical stone and the ability to raise storms. He is thought to lie in the Vale of Gwent. Finally, the cairn on the summit of Brown Willy is said to house the sleeping king of Cornish folklore. Another famous figure from Arthurian legend is the wizard Merlin. Legend has it that King Vortigern chose Dinas Emrys in North Wales as the site for his castle. Yet the workers would return each morning to find the newly built walls in ruins. The king's sorcerers advised that the only solution was to sprinkle the ground with the blood of a child born to a mother of this world and a father of the other world. When the child, Myrddin Emrys, who became the Great Merlin, was found, he declared that 2 dragons lay under a lake within the mountain and were destroying the foundations of the castle each night. On digging down, a lake was indeed discovered, and 2 sleeping dragons were found at the bottom, one red, one white. When they awoke, a great battle ensued between them, ending when the white dragon fled and the red fell back into slumber underneath the hill. The castle was successfully built, and the red dragon, now immortalized on the Welsh flag, is said to sleep there still. Many battle leaders have been deemed heroes for their warlike prowess. Examples from ages past include Boudica, queen of the Incenti tribe, who defended her people patriotically against the Romans, and of course, Robert the Bruce and William Wallace, both surrounded by legends of their glory in the fight for Scottish independence against England. Other folk heroes were always outside the law, and some were loved despite their dark deeds and misadventures. For centuries, none has been so famous as a symbol of hope as the infamous outlaw Robin Hood. Cast out to live in the forest and forced to survive through hunting and robbery alone, the tale of this medieval yeoman is now steeped in legend. Perhaps the first mention of the tales of Robin Hood is in a 14th century narrative poem by William Langland, The Vision of Piers Plowman, while ballads about him were first printed nearly 100 years later. Early on, many believers that Robin Hood was a real man who became a hero to the common people in a time of great need and was made famous during the time of political oppression. Later, it was thought that he was an imaginary hero conjured as a figure that the poor people could identify with, being very different from the heroes and kings of the more affluent in society. Whatever the case, Robin Hood was a political hero who despised the exploitation of the poor by the rich, fought back against the laws that restricted hunting on the king's lands, at a time when people faced starvation and hardship, and refused to harm any woman. He and his band of merry men were said to roam throughout Sherwood Forest in Nottinghamshire, and Barnsdale Forest in Yorkshire. In stories, he is characterized by his great bowmanship and his hatred of both the law and the clergy. He reputedly shot and cut off the head of his arch-enemy, the Sheriff of Nottingham. Whatever the truth, it's undeniable that Robin Hood has been, and still is, a people's hero who will live on in English legend for years to come. A new Robin Hood play, based on traditional legend, Robin Hood and the Friar of Fountains Abbey, was written as recently as 2012 and performed at the Furness Traditional Festival, and then Fountains Abbey in Brooklyn, North Yorkshire, said to be the place of Robin Hood's legendary riverside meeting with Friar Tuck. Robin Hood is famous for never hurting the poor. The same cannot be said for the notorious highwayman Dick Turpin, who certainly existed and in his own way became a folk hero. His story originates in Hempstead, Essex, but ends in Yorkshire, and it's thought that the feats of many highwaymen across the country were wrongly attributed to him, which only added to his fame. Despite his reputation as a great villain of British history, he won the people's favor through the tales of his gallantry, charming those he robbed. This respect was far from deserved, since in reality he had no qualms about robbing and beating anyone who stood in his way, including the elderly and the infirmed. One of the most gruesome tales of his deeds was the attack on a 70-year-old pensioner, Joseph Lawrence of Edgware, who was dragged around by his horse, beaten heavily with pistols, and then tortured by being sat on a fire unclothed. Lady Godiva, too, could be called a heroine of the people. There is no doubt that Godiva was a real woman. She was a countess who lived in the 11th century and governed Coventry with her husband, Earl Leofric of Mercia, one of the 4 magnates chosen by King Knut in order to rule over England after it was conquered by the Danes. Legend paints her as a compassionate and brave figure who rode naked through the streets of Coventry, only covered by her long hair, to gain remission for the high taxes levied on the tenants by her husband. She ordered that every citizen should stay indoors, with the windows covered, out of respect. A later addition to the legend is that only one man, Peeping Tom, ignored her request and tried to watch, yet was struck blind before he could catch a glimpse of her. It is said that the Earl did indeed keep his word, considering it a miracle that she could accomplish such a feat without anyone seeing, and removed all taxes except for that on horses. The annual Godiva procession, recently revived, reenacts the story. Saint Winifred, or Winifred, is sometimes known as the Welsh Lazarus. The story goes that in the 7th century, a Welsh nobleman charged Beuno, his brother-in-law, with the task of erecting a church and providing religious instruction for his daughter Winifred. However, a local chieftain named Caradog wanted Winifred for his wife and made advances, which he ardently refused. Caradog's rising passion soon got the better of him, and he tried to force himself on the girl, at which point she fled to the safety of the church. The story then takes an unusual turn, as a spring gushed from the ground in the place where her head fell, after which it rolled. Oh wait, I skipped a few lines, I'm sorry. He then became mad with lust and rage and cut off her head. The story then takes an unusual turn as a spring gushed from the ground in the place where her head fell, after which it rolled along the feet of the congregation, calling out to God for vengeance. Beuno, now holding the head in his hands, invoked a holy curse against the murderer, who was wiping his sword on the grass next to Winifred's lifeless form. Caradog died at once, disappearing entirely. Beuno, or whatever, I can't pronounce his name, placed Winifred's head on her body and called the congregation to pray with him to restore the girl to life. At this, Winifred sat up, revived, yet a thin white line would form thenceforth, encircling her throat in the place where her head had been severed. Rumor tells that the blood from that fateful day still stains the stones of the Holy Well, which gives its name to Holywell in Flintshire, and people still visit the spring for healing. Right? People are crazy. I love you so much. You are saying no to me. I'm going to kill you. Goodbye. Okay. The last story in this book I want to save for last. So let me turn on my scribe and we will read Sleepy Hollow. I'm going to say it's kind of long. It's about an hour long. In the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, at that broad expansion of the river denominated by the ancient Dutch navigators the Tappan Zee, and where they always prudently shortened sail and implored the protection of St. Nicholas when they crossed, there lies a small market town or rural port, which by some is called Greensburg, but which is more generally and properly known by the name Tarrytown. This name was given, we are told, in former days, by the good housewives of the adjacent country, from the inveterate propensity of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days. Be that as it may, I do not vouch for the fact, but merely advert to it for the sake of being precise and authentic. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a little valley, or rather lap of land among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, with just a murmur enough to lull one to repose, and the occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks in upon the uniform tranquility. I recollect that, when a stripling, my first exploit in squirrel shooting was in a grove of tall walnut trees that shades one side of the valley. I had wandered into it at noontime, when all nature is particularly quiet, and was startled by a roar of my own gun. It was as it broke the Sabbath stillness around, and was prolonged and reverberated by the angry echoes. If ever I should wish for a retreat whither I might steal from the world and its distractions, and dream quietly away the remnant of troubled life, I know of none more promising than this little valley. Time to take a drink. From the listless repose of the place, and the peculiar character of its inhabitants, who are descendants from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads are called the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout all the neighboring country. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land, and to pervade the very atmosphere. Some say the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others, that an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his pow-pows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. Certain it is, the place still continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in a continual reverie. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, are subject to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights, and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot, and meteors glare oftener across the valley than in any other part of the country, and the nighttime, with her whole ninefold, seems to make it the favorite scene of her gambols. The dominant spirit, however, that haunts this enchanted region and seems to be commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air is the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. It is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War, and who is ever and anon seen by the country folk hurrying along in the gloom of night, as if on the wings of the wind. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extended at times to the adjacent roads, and especially to the vicinity of a church at no great distance. Indeed, certain of the most authentic historians of those parts, who have been careful in collecting and collating the floating facts concerning this spectre, allege the body of the trooper having been buried in the churchyard. The ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest for his head, and that the rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow, like a midnight blast, is owing to his being belated and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. Such is the general purport of this legendary superstition, which has furnished materials for many a wild story in the region of shadows, and the spectre is known at all the country firesides by the name the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. It is remarkable that the visionary propensity I have mentioned is not confined to the native inhabitants of the valley, but is unconsciously imbibed by everyone who resides there for a time. However wide awake they may have been before they entered the sleepy region, they are sure, in a little time, to have inhaled the witching influence of the air, and begin to grow imaginative, to dream dreams and see apparitions. I mention this peaceful spot with all possible laud, for it is in such little retired Dutch valleys, found here and there embosomed in the great state of New York, that populations, manners, and customs remain fixed, while the great torrent of migration and improvement, which is making such incessant changes in other parts of this restless country, sweeps by them unobserved. They are like those little nooks of still water, which border a rapid stream, where we may see the straw and bubble riding quietly at anchor or slowly revolving in their mimic harbor, undisturbed by the rush of the passing current. Though many years have elapsed since I trod the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, yet I question whether I should not still find the same trees and the same families vegetating in its sheltered bosom. In this by-place of nature there abode, in a remote period of American history, that is to say, some 30 years since, a worthy wight of the name Ichabod Crane, who sojourned, or as he expressed it, tarried, in Sleepy Hollow, for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity. He was a native of Connecticut, a state which supplies the Union with pioneers for the mind as well as for the forest, and sends forth yearly his legions of frontier woodsmen and country schoolmasters. The cognomen of Crane was not inapplicable to his person. He was tall, but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet that might have served for shovels, and his whole frame most loosely... I'm assuming... I don't know. My phone was ringing. Anyway. I lost my place. His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long sniped nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. To see him starting along the profile on a hill on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for the genius of famine descending upon the earth, or some scarecrow eloped from a cornfield. His schoolhouse was by a low building of one large room, rudely constructed of logs, the windows partly glazed and partly patched with leaves of old copybooks. It was most ingeniously secured at vacant hours by a wide twisted in the handle of the door and stakes set against the window shutters, so that though the thief might get in with perfect ease, he would find some embarrassment in getting out, an idea most probably borrowed by the architect, Jos van Houten, from the mystery of an eel pot. The schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation, just at the foot of a woody hill, with a brook running close by and a formidable birch tree growing at one end of it. From hence the low murmur of his pupils' voices, conning over their lessons, might be heard in a drowsy summer's day, like the hum of a beehive, interrupted now and then by the authoritative voice of the master, in the tone of menace or command, or, peradventure, by the appalling sound of the birch, as he emerged some tardy loiterer along the flowery path of knowledge. Truth to say, he was a conscientious man, and never bore in mind the golden maxim, spare the rod and spoil the child. Ichabod Crane's scholars certainly were not spoiled. I would not have imagined, however, that he was one of those cruel totnets of the school who joyed in the smart of their subjects. On the contrary, he administered justice with discrimination rather than severity, taking the burden off the backs of the weak and laying it on those of the strong. Your mere puny stripling, that winced at the least flourish of the rod, was passed by with indulgence, but the claims of justice were satisfied by inflicting a double portion on some little tough, wrong-headed, broad-skirted Dutch urchin, who sulked and swelled and grew dogged and sullen beneath the birch. All this he called doing his duty by their parents, and he never inflicted a chastisement without following it by the assurance, so consolatory to the smarting urchin, that he would remember it and thank him for it in the longest day he had to live. When school hours were over, he was even the companion and playmate of the larger boys, and on holiday afternoons would convoy some of the smaller ones home, who happened to have pretty sisters or good housewives for mothers, noted for the comforts of the cupboard. Indeed, it behooved him to keep on good terms with his pupils. The revenue arising from his school was small, and would have been scarcely sufficient to furnish him with daily bread, for he was a huge feeder, and, though lank, had the dilating powers of an anaconda. But to help out his maintenance, he was, according to the country custom in those parts, boarded and lodged at the houses of the farmers whose children he instructed. With these he lived successively a week at a time, thus going the rounds of the neighborhood with all of his worldly effects tied up in a cotton handkerchief. That all this might not be so onerous on the purses of his rustic patrons, who were apt to consider the cost of schooling a grievous burden, the schoolmasters, as mere drones, he had various ways of rendering himself both useful and agreeable. He assisted the farmers occasionally in the lighter labors of their farms, helped to make hay, mended the fences, took the horses to water, drove the cows from pasture, and cut wood for the winter fire. He laid aside, too, all the dominant dignity and absolute sway with which he lorded it in his little empire, the school. It became wonderfully gentle and ingratiating. He found favor in the eyes of the mothers by petting the children, particularly the youngest, and like the lion bold, which Wilhelm so magnanimously the lamb did hold, he would sit with the child on his knee, and rock and cradle with his foot for whole hours together. Rock a cradle with his foot for whole hours together. In addition to his other vocations, he was the singing master of the neighborhood, and picked up many bright shillings by instructing young folk in psalmody. It was a matter of no little vanity to him on Sundays to take his station in front of the church gallery with a band of chosen singers, where, in his own mind, he completely carried away the palm from the parson. Certain it is, his voice resounded far above all the rest of the congregation, and there a peculiar quaver still be heard in that church, and which may even be heard half a mile off, quite to the opposite side of the mill pond, on a Sunday morning, which are said to be legitimately descended from the nose of Ichabod Crane. Thus, by divers little makeshifts, in that ingenious way which is commonly denominated by hook and by crook, the worthy pedagogue got on tolerably enough, and was thought by all who understood nothing of labor of headwork, to have wonderfully easy life of it. The schoolmaster is generally a man of some importance in the female circle of a rural neighborhood, being considered a kind of idle, gentlemanlike personage, of vastly superior taste and accomplishments to the rough country swains, and, indeed, inferior in learning only to the parson. His appearance, therefore, is apt to occasion some little stir at the tea-table of a farmhouse, and the addition of a supernumerary dish of cakes, or sweetmeats, or, peradventure, the parade of a silver teapot. Our man of letters, therefore, was peculiarly happy in the smiles of all the country damsels. How he would figure among them in such a churchyard, between services on Sundays, gathering grapes for them from the wild vines that overran the surrounding trees, reciting for their amusement all the epitaphs on the tombstones, or sauntering, with a whole bevy of them, along the banks of the adjacent mill pond, while the more bashful country bumpkins hung sheepishly back, envying his superior elegance and address. From his half-itinerant life, also, he was a kind of traveling gazette, carrying the whole budget of a local gossip from house to house, so that his appearance was always greeted with satisfaction. He was, moreover, esteemed by the women as a man of great erudition, for he had read several books quite through, and was a perfect master of Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, in which, by the way, was most firmly and potently believed. He was, in fact, an odd mixture of small shrewdness and simple credulity. His appetite for the marvelous, and his power of digesting it, were equally extraordinary, and both had been increased by his residence in this spellbound region. No tale was too gross or monstrous for his capacious swallow. It was often his delight, after his school was dismissed in the afternoon, to stretch himself on the rich bed of clover bordering the little brook that whimpered by his schoolhouse, and there con over old Mather's direful tales, until the gathering dusk of evening made the printed page a mere mist before his eyes. Then, as he wended his way by swamp and stream and awful woodland to the farmhouse where he had happened to be quartered, every sound of nature, and that witching hour, fluttered his excited imagination, the moan of the whip-poor-will from the hillside, the boding cry of the tree-toad and the harbinger of storm, the dreary hooting of the screech-owl, or the sudden rustling of the thicket of birds frightened from their roost. The fireflies, too, which sparked most vividly in the darkest places, now and then startled him, as one of uncommon brightness would stream across his path, and if, by chance, a huge blockhead of a beetle came winging its blundering flight against him, the poor Valret was ready to give up the ghost, with the idea that he was struck with a witch's token. His only resource on such occasions, either to drown thought or drive away evil perils, was to sing psalm tunes, and the good people of Sleepy Hollow, as they sat by their doors of an evening, were often filled with awe at hearing his nasal melody, in linked sweetness long and drawn out, floating from the distant hill or along the dusky road. Another of his sources of fearful pleasure was to pass long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives, as they sat spinning by the fire, with a row of apples roasting and sputtering along the hearth, and listen to their marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins and haunted fields and haunted brooks, and haunted bridges and haunted houses, and particularly of the Headless Horseman, or Galloping Hessian of the Hollow, as they sometimes called him. He would delight them equally by his anecdotes of witchcraft and of direful omens and portentous sights and sounds in the air which prevailed in the earliest times of Connecticut, and would frighten them wilfully with speculations upon comets and shooting stars, and that the alarming fact the world did absolutely turn around, and that they were half the time topsy-turvy. But if there was a pleasure in all of this, while snugly cuddling in the chimney corner of a chamber that was all of a ruddy glow from the crackling wood fire, and where, of course, no spectre dared to show its face, it was dearly purchased by the terrors of his subsequent walk homewards, that fearful shapes and shadows beset his path amidst the dim and ghastly glare of the snowy night. With what wistful look did he eye every trembling ray of light streaming across the wasted fields from some distant window. How often he was appalled by some shrub covered in snow which, like a sheeted spectre, beset his very path. How often did he shrink with curdling awe at the sound of his own steps on the frosty crust beneath his feet, and dreaded to look over his shoulder lest he should behold some uncouth being tramping close behind him. And how often, as he thrown into complete dismay by some rushing blast howling along the trees in the idea that it was the Galloping Hessian on one of his nightly scourings. All these, however, were mere terrors of the night, phantoms of the mind that walk in the darkness. And though he had seen many spectres in his time, and had been more than once beset by Satan in diverse shapes, in his lonely perambulations, yet daylight put an end to all these evils, and he would have passed a pleasant life of it, in spite of the devil and all his works, if his path had not been crossed by a being that causes more perplexity to mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and the whole race of witches put together, and that was a woman. Among the musical disciplines who assembled one evening in each week to receive his instruction in psalmody was Katrina Van Tassel, the daughter and only child of a substantial Dutch farmer. She was a blossoming lass of fresh 18, plump as a partridge, ripe and melting and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches, and universally famed, not merely for her beauty, but her vast expectations. She was, withal, a little of a coquette, as might be perceived even in her dress, which was a mixture of ancient and modern fashions, as most suited to set off her charms. She wore the ornament of pure yellow gold, which her great-great-great-grandmother had brought over from Sardam, the tempting stomacher of the olden time, and withal a provokingly short petticoat to display the prettiest foot and ankle in the country round. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart towards the sex, and it was not to be wondered at that so tempting a morsel soon found favor in his eyes, more especially after he had visited her in her parental mansion. Old Balthus Van Tassel was a perfect picture of a thriving, contented, liberal-hearted farmer. He seldom, it is true, sent either his eyes or his thoughts beyond the boundaries of his own farm, but within those everything was snug, happy, and well-conditioned. He was satisfied with his wealth, but not proud of it, and piqued himself upon the hearty abundance rather than the style in which he lived. His stronghold was situated on the banks of the Hudson, in one of those green, sheltered, fertile nooks in which the Dutch farmers are so fond of nestling. A great elm tree spread its broad branches over it, at the foot of which bubbled up a spring of the softest and sweetest water, in a little well formed of a barrel, and then, still sparkling away through the grass, to a neighboring brook that babbled along among adlers and dwarf willows. Hard by the farmhouse was a vast barn that might have been served for a church, every window and crevice of which seemed bursting forth with the treasures of the farm. The flail was thusly resounding within it from morning to night, Swallows and martins skimmed twittering about the eaves, and rows of pigeons, some with one eye turned up, as if watching the weather, some with their heads under their wings or buried in their bosoms, and others swelling and cooing and bowing about their dames, were enjoying the sunshine on the roof. Sleek, unwieldy porkers were grunting in repose and abundance in their pens, from whence sallied forth, now and then, troops of suckling pigs, as if to snuff the air. A stately squadron of snowy geese were riding in an adjoining pond, convoying whole fleets of ducks. Regiments of turkeys were gobbled through the farmyard, and guinea fowls, fretting about it, like ill-tempered housewives, with their peevish, discontented cry. Before the barn door strutted the gallant cock, and crowning that pattern of a husband, a warrior, and a fine gentleman, clapping his burnished wings and crowning in the pride and gladness of his heart. Sometimes tearing up the earth with his feet, and then generously calling his ever-hungry family of wives and children to enjoy the rich morsel which he had discovered. The pedagogue's mouth watered.
Yes. I pause. What's up?
Sparkly water time. You're so sweet. Thank you. Posture check. Okay. I mean, I'm kind of sitting strangely in my chair, but okay, I took another sip. I guess I did choose the right amount of stuff today.
Stretch. Okay. Refreshed.
Thank you for reminding me. The pedagogue's mouth watered as he looked upon this sumptuous promise of luxurious winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye, he pictured to himself every roasting pig running about with a pudding in its belly and an apple in its mouth. That's my place. The pigeons were snugly put to bed in a comfortable pie and tucked in with a coverlet of crust. The geese were swimming in their own gravy, and the ducks pairing cozily in dishes like snug married couples with a decadent competency of onion sauce. In the porkers he saw carved out the future sleek side of bacon and juicy This is so sad coming from somebody that doesn't like eating animals. And juicy relishing ham, not a turkey, but he beheld daintily trussed up, with its gizzards under its wing, and peradventure a necklace of savory sausages, and even bright Chanticleer himself lay sprawling on his back in a side dish, with uplifted claws as if carving that quarter which his chivalrous spirit disdained to ask while living. As the enraptured Ichabod fancied all this, and as he rolled his great green eyes over the fat meadowlands, the rich fields of wheat, of rye, of buckwheat, and Indian corn, and the orchards burdened with ruddy fruit, which surrounded the warm tenement of Van Tassel, his heart yearned after the damsel who was to inherit these domains, and his imagination expanded with the idea how they might be readily turned into cash, and the money invested in immense tracts of wild land, and shingled palaces in the wilderness. Nay, his busy fancy already realized his hopes, and presented to him the blooming Katrina, with a whole family of children, mounted on the top of a wagon loaded with household trumpetry, with pots and kettles dangling beneath, and he beheld himself bestriding a pacing mare with a colt at her heels, setting out for Kentucky, Tennessee, or the Lord knows where. When he entered the house, the conquest of his heart was complete. It was one of those spacious farmhouses with high-ridged but lowly sloped roofs, built in the style handed down from the Dutch settlers, the low projecting eaves forming a piazza along the front, capable of being closed up in bad weather. Under this there hung flails, harness, various utensils of husbandry, and nets for fishing in the neighboring river. Benches were built along the sides of for summer use, and a great spinning wheel at one end and a churn at the other showed the various uses to which this important porch might be devoted. From this piazza, the wondering Ichabod entered the hall, which formed the center of the mansion, and the place of usual residence. Here, rows of resplendent pewter, arranged on a long dresser, dazzled his eyes. In one corner stood a huge bag of wool, ready to be spun. In another, a quantity of linsey woolsey, just from the loom. Ears of Indian corn and strings of dried apples and peaches hung in gay festoons along the walls, mingled with the gaud of red peppers, and a door left ajar gave him a peep into the best parlor, where the clawed-footed chairs and dark mahogany tables shone like mirrors. Andrians, with their accompanying shovels and tongs, glistened from their covered covert of asparagus tops. Mock oranges and conch shells decorated the mantelpiece. Strings of various colored bird eggs were suspended above it. A gray ostrich egg was hung from the center of the room, and a corner cupboard, knowingly left open, displayed immense treasures of old silver and well-mended china. From the moment Ichabod laid his eyes upon the regions of delight, the peace of his mind was at an end, and his only study was how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter of Van Tassel. In this enterprise, however, he had more real difficulties than generally fell to the lot of knight-errants of yore, who seldom had anything but giants, enchanters, fiery dragons, and such like easily conquered adversaries to contend with, and had to make his way merely through the gates of iron and brass and walls of adamant to the castle keep, where the lady of his heart was confined. All which he had achieved easily as a man would carve his way into the center of a Christmas pie, and then the lady gave him her hand as a matter of course. Ichabod, on the contrary, had to win his way to the heart of a country coquette, beset with a labyrinth of whims and caprices, which were forever presenting new difficulties and impediments, and he had to encounter a host of fearful adversaries of real flesh and blood, the numerous rustic admirers who beset every portal to her heart, keeping a watchful and angry eye upon each other, but ready to fly out in the common cause against any new competitor. Among these, the most formidable was a burly, roistering blade of the name Abraham, or, according to the Dutch abbreviation, Brom Van Burnt, the hero of the country round, which rang with his feats of strength and hardihood. He was broad-shouldered and double-jointed, with short curly black hair, and a bluff, not unpleasant countenance, having a mingled air of fun and arrogance. From his Herculean frame, the great powers of limb, he had received the nickname of Brom Bones, by which he was universally known. He was famed for great knowledge and skill in horsemanship, being as dexterous on horseback as Tartar. He was foremost at all races and cockfights, and with the ascendancy which bodily strength always acquires in rustic life. Yes, Mungo. What? You can come and cuddle. Looks like cat break. I don't think we're going to finish this one. I still have apparently like 40 minutes to read in this, according to my scribe. But we will get as far as we can, and if I finish it tomorrow, I'll finish it tomorrow. I can't reach you if you lean back. Okay. And with the ascendancy which bodily strength always acquires in rustic life, was the umpire in all disputes, setting his hat on one side and giving his decisions with an air and tone that admitted of no gainsay or appeal. He was always ready for either a fight or a frolic. She said, yes, you guys can come cuddle. We'll make a cuddle puddle. I lost my place. Hold on. But had more mischief than ill will in his composition, and with all his overbearing roughness, there was a strong dash of waggish good humor at the bottom. He had 3 or 4 boon companions who regarded him as their model, and at the head of whom he scoured the country, attending every scene or feud or merriment for miles around. In cold weather, he was distinguished by a fur cap surmounted with a flaunting fox's tail. And when the folks of the country gathering decreed this well-known crest as at a distance, whisking about among the squad of hard riders, they always stood by for a squall. Sometimes his crew would be heard dashing along past the farmhouses at midnight with a whoop and halloo, like a troop of Don Cossacks. And the old dames, startled out of their sleep, would listen for a moment until the hurry-scurry had clattered by, and then exclaim, "Aye, there goes Brom Bones and his gang." The neighbors looked upon him with a mixture of awe, admiration, and goodwill, and, when any madcap prank or rustic brawl occurred in the vicinity, always shook their heads and warranted Brom Bones was at the bottom of it. This rantical hero had for some time singled out the blooming Caterina for the object of his uncouth gallantries, and though his amorous toyings were something like the gentle caresses and endearments of a bear, yet it was his whisper that she did not altogether discourage his hopes. Certain it is his advances were signals for rival candidates to retire, who felt no inclination to cross a lion in its amours, insomuch that when his horse was seen tied to Van Tassel's paling on a Sunday night, a sure sign that his master was courting, or, as it was termed, sparking within, all other suitors passed by in despair and carried the war into other quarters. Such was the formidable rival with whom Ichabod Crane had to contend, and considering all things, a stouter man than he would have shrunk from the competition, and a wiser man would have despaired. He had, however, a happy mixture of pliability and perseverance in his nature. He was in form and spirit like a supple jack, yielding but tough. Though he bent, he never broke, and though he bowed beneath the slightest pressure, yet, the moment it was away, jerk! He was erect, and carried his head as high as ever. To have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness, for he was not a man to be thwarted in his amours, any more than that stormy lover, Achilles. Ichabod, therefore, made his advances in quiet and in a gently insinuating manner. Under the cover of his character of singing master, he made frequent visits at the farmhouse, not that he had anything to apprehend from the meddlesome interference of parents, which is so often a stumbling block in the path of lovers. Walt Van Tassel was an easy, indulgent soul. He loved his daughter better than his pipe, and, like a reasonable man, an excellent father, he let her have her way in everything. His notable little wife, too, had enough to do to attend to her housekeeping and manage her poultry, for, as she sagely observed, ducks and geese are foolish things and must be looked after, but girls can take care of themselves. Thus, while the busy dame bustled about the house or plied her spinning wheel at one end of the piazza, honest Balt would sit smoking his evening pipe at the other, watching the achievements of the little wooden warrior who, armed with his sword in each hand, was most valiantly fighting the wind on the pinnacle of the barn. In the meantime, Ichabod would carry on his suit with the daughter by his side of the spring under the great elm, or sauntering along the twilight, that hour so favorable to lovers' eloquence. I profess not to know how women's hearts are wooed and won. To me, they have always been matters of riddle and admiration. Some seem to have but one vulnerable point or door of access, while others have a thousand avenues and may be captured in 1,000 different ways. It is a great triumph of skill to gain the former, but still a greater proof of generalship to maintain possession of the latter. For a man must battle for his fortress at every door and window. He who wins 1,000 common hearts is therefore entitled to some renown, but he who keeps undisputed sway over the heart of a coquette is indeed a hero. Certain it is, this was not the case with the redoubtable Brom Bones, and from the moment Ichabod Crane made his advances, the interests of the former evidently declined. His horse was no longer seen tied to the palings on Sunday nights, and a deadly feud gradually arose between him and the preceptor of Sleepy Hollow. Brom, who had a degree of rough chivalry in his nature, would fain have carried matters to open warfare and have settled their pretensions to the lady, according to the mode of those concise and simple reasoners, the knights errant of yore, by single combat. But Ichabod was too conscious of the superior might of his adversary to enter the lists against him. He had overheard a boast of Bones, and that he would double the schoolmaster up and lay him on a shelf of his own schoolhouse, and he was too wary to give him an opportunity. There was something extremely provoking in this obstinately pacific system. It left Brom no alternative but to draw upon the funds of rustic waggery in his disposition and play off boorish practical jokes upon his rival. Ichabod became the object of whimsical persecution to Bones and his gang of rough riders. They harried his hitherto peaceful domains, smoked out his singing schoolhouse by stopping up the chimney, broke into the schoolhouse at night, in spite of its formidable fastenings of withen window stakes, and turned everything topsy-turvy so that the poor schoolmaster began to think that all the witches in the country held their meetings there. But, what was still more annoying, Brom took all opportunities of turning him to ridicule in the presence of his mistress, and had a scoundrel dog whom he taught to whine in the most ludicrous manner, and introduced as a rival of Ichabod's to instruct her in psalmody. In this way matters went on for some time, without producing any material effect on the relative situations of the contending powers. On a fine autumnal afternoon, Ichabod, in pensive mood, sat enthroned on a lofty stool from whence he usually watched all the concerns of his little literary realm. In his hand he swayed a ferule, a scepter of despotic power. The birch of justice reposed on 3 nails behind the throne, a constant terror to evildoers, while on the desk before him might be seen sundry contraband articles and prohibited weapons detected upon the persons of idle urchins, such as half-munched apples, pop-guns, whirligigs, fly-cages, and a whole legion of rampant little paper gamecocks. Apparently, there had been some appalling act of justice recently inflicted, for his scholars were all bustily intent upon their books, or slyly whispering behind them, with one eye kept upon the master, and a kind of buzzing stillness reigned throughout the schoolroom. It was suddenly interrupted by the appearance of I really don't want to say that word. By a dark-skinned individual in tow-cloth jacket and trousers, a round-crowned fragment of a hat, like the cap of Mercury, and mounted on the back of a ragged, wild, half-broken colt, which he managed with a rope by way of a halter. He came clattering up to the school door with an invitation to Ichabod to attend a merry-making or quilt frolic to be held that evening at My Here Van Tassel's, and having delivered his message with that air of importance and effort at fine language such an individual is apt to display on petty embassies of the kind, he dashed over the brook and was seen scampering away up the hollow, full of the importance and hurry of his mission. All was now bustle and hubbub in the late quiet schoolroom. The scholars... Hi, Mungo. You made me lose my place. The scholars were hurried through their lessons without stopping at trifles. Who were nimble skipped over half-wit impudently, and those who were tardy had a smart application now and then in the rear to quicken their speed or help them over the tall word. Books were flung aside without being put away on the shelves. Inkstands were overturned, benches thrown down, and the whole school was turned loose for an hour before the usual time, bursting forth like a legion of young imps, yelping and racketing about the green in joy at their early emancipation. The gallant Ichabod now spent at least an extra half-hour at his toilet, brushing and furbishing up his best, and indeed only suit of rusty black, and arranging his locks by a bit of broken-looking glass that hung upon the schoolhouse, that he might make his appearance before his mistress in the true style of a cavalier. He borrowed a horse from a farmer with whom he was domiciliated, a choleric old Dutchman. Mungo, don't you dare lay on the keyboard. Don't do it. Okay. A choleric old Dutchman of the name of Hans van Ripper, and thus, gallantly mounted, issued forth like a knight-errant in quest of adventures. But it is meet I should, in the untrue spirit of romantic story, give some account of the looks and equipment of my hero and his steed. The animal he bestrode was a broken-down plough horse that had outlived almost everything but its viciousness. He was gaunt and shaggy, with a ewe-neck and a head like a hammer. His rusty mane and tail were tangled and knotted with burrs. One eye had lost its pupil and was glaring and spectral, but the other had a gleam of genuine devil in it. Still, he must have had fire and metal in his day, if we may judge from the name he bore of Gunpowder. He had, in fact, been a favorite steed of his master's, the choleric Van Ripper, who was a furious rider and had infused very probably, some of his own spirit into the animal, for, and old and broken down as he was, there was more of a lurking devil in him than in any young filly in the country. Ichabod was at a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups, which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of the saddle. His sharp elbows stuck out like grasshoppers. He carried his whip perpendicularly in his hand, like a scepter, and his horse jogged on. The motion of his arms was not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings. A small wool hat rested atop his nose, for so his scanty strip of forehead might be called, and the skirts of his black coat fluttered out almost to the horse-tail. Such was the appearance of Ichabod and his steed as they shambled out of the gate of Hans Van Ripper, and it was altogether such an apparition as is seldom to be met with the broad daylight. It was, as I have said, a fine autumnal day. The sky was clear and serene, and nature wore that rich golden livery which we always associate with the idea of abundance. The forests had put on their sober brown and yellow, while some trees, the tenderer kind, had been nipped by the frosts into brilliant dyes of orange, purple, and scarlet. Streaming files of wild ducks began to make their appearance high in the air. The bark of the squirrel might be heard from the groves of beech and hickory nuts, and the pensive whistle of a quail at intervals from neighboring stubble fields. The small birds were taking their farewell banquets. In the fullness of their revelry, they fluttered, chirping and frolicking from bush to bush and tree to tree, capricious from the very profusion and variety around them. There was the honest cock-robin from the favorite game of stripling sportsmen, with its loud, querulous note, and the twittering blackbirds flying in sable clouds, and the golden-winged woodpecker with his crimson crest, his broad black gorget and splendid plumage, and the cedar bird with his red-tipped wings and yellow-tipped tail, and its little Montiero cap of feathers, and the blue jay, that noisy coxswain, in his gay light blue coat and white underclothes, screaming and chattering, nodding and bobbing and bowing, and pretending to be on good terms with every songer of the grove. As Ichabod jogged slowly on his way, his eye, ever open to every symptom of culinary abundance, ranged with delight over the treasures of jolly autumn. On all sides he beheld vast store of apples, some hanging in oppressive opulence on the trees, some gathered into baskets and barrels for the market, others heaped up in rich piles for cider press. Farther on he beheld great fields of Indian corn, with its golden ears peeping from their leafy covers, and holding out the promise of cakes and hasty puddings, and the yellow pumpkins lying beneath them, turning up their fair round bellies to the sun, and giving ample prospect of the most luxurious of pies. And anon he passed the fragrant buckwheat fields, breathing the odor of beehive, and as he beheld them, soft anticipation stole over his mind of dainty slapjacks, well buttered and garnished with honey or treacle by the delicate little dimpled hand of Katrina Van Tassel. Thus feeding his mind with many sweet thoughts and sugared suppositions, he journeyed along the sides of a range of hills which looked out upon some of the goodliest scenes of the mighty Hudson. The sun gradually wheeled his dark disk down in the west. His broad disk. Why did I say dark? Oh wait, time out. I forgot to start recording, so I have to start reading all over again. Because we're gonna put this up on YouTube. I knew I was forgetting something. Anyway, this time I won't mess it up as much. Thus, feeding his mind with many sweet thoughts and sugared suppositions, he journeyed along the sides of a range of hills which looked out upon some of the goodliest scenes of the mighty Hudson. The sun gradually wheeled his broad disk down in the west. The wide bosom of the Tapansee lay motionless and glassy, excepting that here and there a gentle undulation waved and prolonged the blue shadow of the distant mountain. I mean, I've been asked quite a bit to record and post things, so I thought may as well, if I'm not putting a lot of strain on my computer, I can record while I'm streaming and then let my computer do it overnight when I'm sleeping. A few amber clouds floated in the sky without a breath of air to move them. The horizon was of a fine golden tint, changing gradually into a pure apple green, and from that into the deep blue of the mid-heaven. A slanting ray lingered on the woody crests of the precipices that overhung some parts of the river, giving greater depths to the dark gray and purple of their rocky sides. Poor PC is working overtime. A sloop was loitering in the distance, dropping slowly down with the tide, her sail hanging uselessly against the mast, and as the reflection of the sky gleamed along the still water, it seemed as if the vessel was suspended in the air. It was towards the evening that Ichabod arrived at the castle of Heer Van Tassel, which he found thronged with the pride and flower of the adjacent country. old farmers, a spare leather-faced race, in homespun coats and breeches, blue stockings, huge shoes, and magnificent pewter buckles. Their brisk, withered little dames, in close-crimped caps, long-waisted short gowns, homespun petticoats, and scissors and pincushions, and gay calico pockets hanging on the side. Buxom lasses almost as antiquated as their mothers, excepting where a straw hat, a fine ribbon, or perhaps a white frock gave symptoms of city innovation. The sons, in short square skirted coats, with rows of stupendous brass buttons, and their hair generally hued in the fashion of the times, especially if they could procure an eelskin for the purpose, it being esteemed throughout the country as a potent nourisher and strengthener of the hair. Brom Bones, however, was the hero of the scene, having come to gather on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature, like himself, full of mettle and mischief, and which no one but himself could manage. He was, in fact, noted for preferring vicious animals, given to all kinds of tricks which kept the rider in constant risk of his neck, for he held a traceable, well-broken horse, was unworthy of a lad of spirit. Fain would I pause to dwell upon the world of charms that burst upon the enraptured gaze of my hero, as he entered the state parlor of Van Tassel's mansion. Not those of the bevy buxom lasses, with their luxurious display of red and white, but the ample charms of a genuine Dutch country tea-table in the sumptuous time of autumn. Such heaped-up platters of cakes of various and almost indescribable kinds, known only to experienced Dutch housewives. There was the doughy donut, the tender oily coke, and the crisp and crumbling cruller, sweet cakes and shortcakes, ginger cakes and honey cakes, and the whole family of cakes. And then there were apple pies and peach pies and pumpkin pies, besides slices of ham and smoked beef, and moreover delectable dishes of preserved plums and peaches and pears and quinces, not to mention broiled shad and roast chickens, together with bowls of milk and cream, all mingled higgledy-piggledy, pretty much as I have enumerated them, with the motherly teapot setting upon its clouds of vapor from the midst. Them with the... oh, heaven bless the mart! I want breath and time to discuss this banquet as it deserves, and I'm too eager to get on with my story. Happily, Ichabod Crane was not in so great a hurry as his historian, but did ample justice to every dainty. He was a kind and thankful creature whose heart dilated with proportion as his skin was filled with good cheer, and whose spirits rose with eating as some men's do with drink. He could not help, too, rolling his large eyes round him as he ate, and chuckling with the possibility that he might one day be lord of all this scene of all almost unimaginable luxury and splendor. Then, he thought, how soon he'd turn his back upon the old schoolhouse, snap his fingers in the face of Hans Van Ripper, and every other niggardly patron, and kick any itinerant pedagogue out of doors that should dare call him comrade. But old Bathus Van Tassel moved about among his guests with a face dilated with content and good humor, round and jolly as the harvest moon. His hospitable attentions were brief but expressive, being confined to a shake of the hand, a slap on the shoulder, a loud laugh, and a pressing invitation to fall to and help themselves. And now the sound of the music from the common room, or hall, summoned to the dance. The musician was an old gray-headed African-American. I'm sorry, this was written when certain words were okay, and I am not going to say them. Anyway, this musician was an old gray-headed African-American who had been in the itinerant orchestra of the neighborhood for more than half a century. His instrument was as old and battered as himself. The greater part of time he scraped on 2 or 3 strings, accompanying every movement of the bow with his motion of the head, bowing almost to the ground and stamping with his foot whenever a fresh couple were to start. Ichabod prided himself upon his dancing as much as upon his vocal powers. Not a limb, not a fiber about him was idle, and to have seen his loosely hung frame in full motion and clattering about the room, you would have thought St. Vitus himself, that blessed patron of the dance, was figuring before you in person. He was the admiration of all the African-Americans who, having gathered of all ages and sizes from the farm and the neighborhood, stood forming a pyramid of shining black faces at every door and window, gazing with delight at the scene, rolling their white eyeballs and showing grinning rows of ivory from ear to ear. How could the flogger of urchins be otherwise than animated and joyous? The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance and smiling graciously in reply to all his amorous oglings, while Brombones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in one corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod was attracted to a knot of Sager folks who, with old Van Tassel, sat smoking at one end of the piazza, gossiping over former times and drawing out long stories about war. This neighborhood, at the time which I am speaking, was one of those highly favored places which abound with chronicle and great men. The British and American line had run near it during the war. It had, therefore, been the scene of marauding and infesting with refugees, cowboys, and all kinds of border chivalry. Just sufficient time had elapsed to enable each storyteller to dress up his tale with a little becoming fiction, and in the indistinctness of his recollection to make himself the hero of every exploit. There was a story of Defoe Martling, a large, blue-bearded Dutchman, who had nearly taken a British frigate with an old iron 9-pounder from a mud breastwork, only that his gun burst at the 6th discharge. And there was an old gentleman who shall be nameless, being too rich to Mynheer to be lightly mentioned, who, in the Battle of White Plains, being an excellent master of defense, parried a musket ball with a small sword, insomuch that he absolutely felt it whiz around the blade and glance off at the hilt. In proof of which he was ready at any time to show the sword, with the hilt a little bent. There were several more that had been equally great in the field, not one of whom but was persuaded that he had a considerable hand in bringing the war to happy termination. But all these were nothing to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that succeeded. The neighborhood is rich in legendary treasures of the kind, local tales and superstitions thriving best in these sheltered, long-settled retreats, but are trampled underfoot by the shifting throngs that forms the population of most of our country places. Besides, there is no encouragement for ghosts in most of our villages, for they have scarcely had time to finish their first nap and turn themselves in their graves before their surviving friends have traveled away from the neighborhood, so that when they turn out at night to walk their rounds, they have no acquaintance left to call upon. This is perhaps the reason why we so seldom hear of ghosts except in our long-established Dutch communities. The immediate cause, however, of the prevalence of supernatural stories in these parts was doubtless owing to the vicinity of Sleepy Hollow. There was a contagion in the very air that blew from the haunted region. It breathed forth at an atmosphere of dreams and fancies infecting all the land. Several of the Sleepy Hollow people were present at Van Tassel's and, as usual, were doling out their wild and wonderful legends. Many dismal tales were told about funeral trains and mourning cries and wailings heard and seen about the great tree where the unfortunate Major Andre was taken, and which stood in the neighborhood. Some mention was made of the woman in white that haunted the dark glen at Raven Rock, and was often heard to shriek on winter nights before a storm, having perished there in the snow. The chief part of these stories, however, turned upon the favorite spectre of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, who had been heard several times of late patrolling the country, and, it is said, tethered his horse nightly among the graves in the churchyard. The sequestered situation of the church seems always to have made it a favorite haunt of troubled spirits. It stands on a knoll, surrounded by locust trees and lofty elms, among which its decent, whitewashed walls shine modestly forth, like Christian purity beaming through the shades of retirement. A gentle slope descends from it in a silver sheet of water, bordered by high trees, between which peeps may be caught at the blue hills of the Hudson. To look upon its grassy-grown yard, where the sunbeams seem to sleep so quietly, one would think that there, at least, the dead might rest in peace. On one side of the church extends a wide woody dell, along which raves a large brook among broken rocks and trunks of fallen trees. Over a deep black part of the stream, not far from the church, was formerly thrown a wooden bridge, and the road that led to it, and the bridge itself, were thickly shaded by overhanging trees, which cast a gloom about it even in the daytime, but occasioned a fearful darkness at night. Such was one of the favorite haunts of the Headless Horseman, and the place where he most often frequented and was encountered. The tale was told of old Bower, a most heretical disbeliever in ghosts, how he met the horseman in returning from his foray in Sleepy Hollow, and was obliged to get up behind him, how they galloped over bush and brake, over hill and swamp until they reached the bridge, when the horseman suddenly turned into a skeleton, threw old Bower into the brook, and sprang away over the treetops with a clap of thunder. This story was immediately matched by thrice marvelous adventure of Brom Bones, who made light of the galloping Hessian as an errant jockey. He affirmed that on returning one night from the neighboring village of Sing Sing, he had been overtaken by this midnight trooper, that he had offered to race him for a bowl of punch, and should have won it too, for Daredevil beat the goblin's horse at Hollow. But just as they came to the church bridge, the Hessian bolted and vanished in a flash of fire. All these tales, told in that drowsy undertone with which men talk in the dark, the countenances of the listeners only now and then receiving a casual gleam from the glare of a pipe, sank deep into the mind of Ichabod. He repaid them in kind with large extracts from his invaluable author, Cotton Mather, and added many marvelous events that had taken place in his native state of Connecticut, and fearful sights which he had seen in his nightly walks about Sleepy Hollow. The revel now gradually broke up. The old farmers gathered together, their families in their wagons, and were heard for some time rattling along the hollow roads and over distant hills. Some of the damsels mounted on pillions, behind their favorite swains, and their light-hearted laughter mingling with the clatter of hoofs, echoed along the silent woodlands, sounding fainter and fainter until they gradually died away, and the late scene of noise and frolic was all silent and deserted. Ichabod only lingered behind, according to the custom of the country lovers, to have a tete-a-tete with the heiress, fully convinced that he was now on the high road to success. Sorry, Discord notification caught my attention. What passed at this interview, I will not pretend to say, for in fact I do not know. Something, however, I fear me, must have gone wrong, for he certainly sallied forth after no very great interval, with an air quite desolate and chapfallen. Oh, these women! Could that girl have been playing off any of her coquettish tricks? What was her encouragement of the poor pedagogue, all a mere sham, to secure her conquest of his rival? Heaven only knows, not I. Let it suffice to say, Ichabod stole forth with the air of one who had been sacking a hen roost rather than a fair lady's heart. Without looking to the right or left to notice the scene of rural wealth, on which he had so often gloated, he went straight to the stable, and with several hearty cuffs and kicks roused his steed most uncourteously from the comfortable quarters in which he was soundly sleeping, dreaming of mountains of corn and oats, and whole valleys of timothy and clover. It was the very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, pursued his travels homeward, along the sides of the lofty hills which rise above Tarrytown, and which he had traversed so cheerfully in the afternoon. The hour was dismal as himself. Far below him the Tappan Zee spread its dusky and indistinct waste of waters, with here and there the tall mast of slooping riding quietly at the anchor under the land. In the dead hush of midnight he could even hear the barking of the watchdogs from the opposite shore of the Hudson, but it was so vague and faint as only to give an idea of his distance from the faithful company of the man. Now and then, too, the long-drawn crowing of a cock accidentally awakened would sound far, far off from the farmhouse away among the hills, but it was like a dreaming sound in his ear. No sign of life occurred near him, but occasionally the melancholy chirp of a cricket, or perhaps the guttural twang of a bullfrog from neighboring marsh, as if sleeping uncomfortably and turning suddenly in his bed. All the stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. The night grew darker and darker, the stars seemed to sink deeper into the sky, and driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. He was, moreover, approaching a very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had been laid. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which towered like a giant above all other trees of the neighborhood, and formed a kind of landmark. Its limbs, gnarled and fantastic, large enough to form trunks for ordinary trees, twisting down almost to the earth and rising again into the air. It was connected with the tragical story of the unfortunate Andre, who had been taken prisoner hard by, and was universally known by the name of Major Andre's tree. The common people regarded it with a mixture of respect and superstition, partly out of sympathy for the fate of its ill-starred namesake, and partly for the tales of the strange sights and doleful lamentations told concerning it. As Ichabod approached his fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered. It was but a blast, sweeping sharply through the dry branches. As he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white, hanging in the midst of the tree. He paused and ceased whistling, but, on looking more narrowly, perceived that it was a place where the tree had been scathed by lightning, and the white wood lay bare. Suddenly he heard a groan. His teeth chattered and his knees smote against the saddle. It was but the rubbing of one huge bow upon another, as they were swaying about by the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new perils lay before him. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy and thickly wooded glen, known by the name of Wiley Swamp. A few rough logs, laid side by side, served for a bridge over the stream. On that side of the road, where the brook entered the wood, a group of oaks and chestnuts matted thick with wild grapevines threw a cavernous gloom over it. To pass this bridge was the severest trial. It was at this identical spot that the unfortunate Andre was captured, and under the covert of those chestnuts and vines were the sturdy yeomen concealed who surprised him. This has ever since been considered a haunted stream, and fearful are the feelings of the schoolboy who has to pass it alone after dark. As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump. He summoned up, however, all resolution, gave his horse half a score of kicks in the ribs, and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge. But instead of starting forward, the perverse old animal made a lateral movement and ran broadside against the fence. Ichabod, whose fears increased with the delay, jerked the reins to the other side and kicked lustily with the contrary foot. It was all in vain. His steed started, but it is true, it was only to plunge to the opposite side of the road into a thicket of brambles and alder bushes. The schoolmaster now bestowed both a whip and heel upon the straggling ribs of old Gunpowder, who dashed forward, snuffling and snorting, but came to a stand just by the bridge, and with a suddenness that had nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head. Just at this moment, a plashy tramp by the same side of the bridge caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove, on the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen and towering. It stirred not, but seemed gathered up in the gloom, like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveler. The hair of the affrighted pedagogue rose upon his head with terror. What was to be done? To turn and fly was now too late, and besides, what chance was there of escaping a ghost or goblin, if it was such, which could ride upon the wings of the wind? Summoning up, therefore, a show of courage, he demanded in stammering accents, "Who are you?" He received no reply. He repeated his demand in a still more agitated voice. Still there was no answer. Once more, he cudgelled the sides of the inflexible Gunpowder, and, shutting his eyes, broke forth with involuntary fervor into psalm tune. Just then the shadowy object of alarm put itself in motion, and with a scramble and a bound stood at once in the middle of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, yet the form of the unknown might now, in some degree, be ascertained. He appeared to be a horseman of large dimensions, and mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. He made no offer of molestation or sociability, but kept aloof on the side of the road, jogging along on the blind side of old Gunpowder, who had now gotten over his fright and waywardness. Ichabod, who had no relish for the strange midnight companion, and bethought himself of the adventure of Brom Bones with the galloping Hessian, now quickened his steed in hopes of leaving him behind. The stranger, however, quickened his horse to an equal pace. Ichabod pulled up and fell into a walk, thinking to lag behind. The other did the same. His heart began to sink within him. He endeavored to resume the psalm tune, but his parched tongue clove to the roof of his mouth, and he could not utter a stave. There was something in the moody and dogged silence of this pertinacious companion that was mysterious and appalling. It was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting and rising ground, which brought the figure of this fellow traveler in relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless. But his horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have rested on the shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of his saddle. His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping by sudden movement to give his companion the slip, but the spectre started full jump with him. Away, then, they dashed through the thick and thin, stones flying and sparking, flashing at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air, and he stretched his long, lank body away over his horse's head in the eagerness of his flight. They had now reached the road which turns off to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, who seemed possessed with a demon, instead of keeping it up, made an opposite turn and plunged headlong downhill to the left. This road leads through a sandy hollow shaded by trees for about a quarter of a mile, where it crosses a bridge famous in goblin stories, and just beyond swells the green knoll on which stands the whitewashed church. As yet, the panic of the steed had given his unskillful rider an apparent advantage in the chase, but just as he had got halfway through the hollow, the girths of the saddle gave way, and he felt it slipping from under him. He seized it by the pommel and endeavored to hold it firm, but in vain, and had just time to save himself by clasping old gunpowder around the neck when the saddle fell to the earth, and he heard it trampled underfoot by his pursuer. For a moment, the terror of Hans Van Ripper's wrath passed across his mind, for it was his Sunday saddle. But this was no time for petty fears. The goblin was hard on his haunches, and, unskillful rider that he was, he had much ado to maintain his seat, sometimes slipping on one side, sometimes on the other, and sometimes jolted on the high ridge of his horse's backbone, with violence that he verily feared would cleave him asunder. An opening in the trees now cheered him with the hopes that the church bridge was at hand. The wavering reflection of the silver star in the bosom of the brook told him that he was not mistaken. He saw the walls of the church dimly glaring under the trees beyond. He recollected the place where Bronbones' ghost competitor had disappeared. If I can but reach that bridge, thought Ichabod, I am saved. Just then he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He even fancied that he felt its hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs, and old gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks, and he gained the opposite side, and now Ichabod cast a look behind to see if his pursuer should vanish according to the rule, in a flash of fire and brimstone. Just then he saw the goblins rising his stirrups, and in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash. He was tumbled headlong into the dust, and gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning the old horse was found without its saddle, and with the bridle under its feet, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearance for breakfast. Dinner hour came, but no Ichabod. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse, and strolled idly about the banks of the brook, but no schoolmaster. Hans Van Ripper now began to feel some uneasiness about the fate of poor Ichabod and his saddle. An inquiry was set on foot, and after diligent investigation they came upon his traces. In one part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle trampled in the dirt, the tracks of the horse's hoofs deeply dented in the road, and evidently at furious speed, were traced to the bridge, beyond which the bank of a broad part of the brook, where the water ran deep and black, was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but the body of the schoolmaster was not to be discovered. Hans Van Ripper was executor of his estate, examined the bundle which contained all of his worldly effects. They consisted of 2 shirts and a half, 2 socks for the neck, a pair or 2 of worsted stockings, an old pair of corduroy small clothes, a rusty razor, a book of psalm tunes full of dog ears, and a broken pitch pipe. As the books and furniture of the schoolhouse, they all belonged to the community, excepting Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, a New England Almanac, and a book of dreams and fortune-telling, in which last was a sheet of foolscap, which scribbled and blotted with several fruitless attempts to make a copy of verses in honor of the heiress of Van Tassel. These magic books and the poetic scrawl were forthwith consigned to the flames by Hans Van Ripper, who from that time forward determined to send his children no more to school, observing that he never knew any good to come of this same reading and writing. Whatever money the schoolmaster possessed, and had received his quarter's pay but a day or 2 before, he must have had about his person at the time of his disappearance. The mysterious event caused much speculation at the church on the following Sunday. Knots of gazers and gossips were collected at the churchyard, at the bridge, and at the spot where the hat and pumpkin had been found. The stories of brewer of bones, and a whole budget of others were called to mind, and when they still had diligently considered them all, and compared them with the symptoms of the present case, they shook their heads and came to the conclusion that Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian. As he was a bachelor, and in nobody's debt, nobody troubled his head any more about him. The school was removed to a different quarter of the hollow, and another pedagogue reigned in its head. It is true, an old farmer who had been down to New York on a visit several years after, and from whom this account of the ghostly adventure was received, brought home the intelligence that Ichabod Crane was still alive, that he had left the neighborhood partly through fear out of the Goblin and Huntsman River, and partly in mortification that, having been suddenly dismissed by the heiress, that he had changed his quarters to a distant part of the country, had kept school and studied law at the same time, had been admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered, written for the newspaper, and finally been made a justice of the 10-pound court. Brom Bones, too, who, shortly after his rival's disappearance, conducted the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar, was observed to look exceedingly knowing whether the story of Ichabod was related, and always burst into hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which led some to suspect that he knew more about the matter than he chose to tell. The old country wives, however, who are the best judges of these matters, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means, and it is a favorite story often told about the neighborhood round the winter evening fire. The bridge became more than ever an object of superstitious awe, and that may be the reason why the road has been altered of late years, so as to approach the church by the border of the Millpond. The schoolhouse being deserted soon fell to decay, and was reported to be haunted by the ghost of the unfortunate pedagogue and the ploughboy, loitering homeward of a still summer evening, has often fancied his voice at a distance, chanting a melancholy psalm tune among the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow. That was the end of that one. Alright, so the next one is like 6 pages long, I think. But I hope I didn't hit a cat because I just threw my ebook like behind me. As with all things, I figured we'd end on death and burial because we're all going to experience that at the end anyway. Britain's folklore contains many customs and superstitions around death, one of the most feared, mysterious, and, of course, inescapable aspects of human existence. Traditions can help to console those left behind and ensure that a beloved family member or friend is prepared fully to meet the spirit of death, whichever form it may take. The oldest ceremonial burial we know of in Western Europe dates from 33,000 years ago, in the Upper Paleolithic period. The Red Lady of Haviland, whose body is dyed red is dyed in a red ochre, was entombed in a cave in Glower, Wales. Death rituals are age-old, it seems, and no doubt our funerals, wakes, and other memorial rituals will one day come to be replaced by others. In centuries past, when many types of illnesses were often fatal, predictions of death were considered of great importance. Death omens abounded in Britain, and sometimes it seemed that every sound or strange occurrence was viewed as a sign of impending doom. Birds and animals play a large role in traditional predictions of death. The recaws of a crow, or the cries of a screech owl, can announce forthcoming death in the southeast of England. In Northamptonshire, a bee entering a house is seen similarly. The ticking of the death watch beetle, the crowing of a cock during the night, or the croak of a raven are all traditional portents of death that are common to the whole of Britain. Woe betide anyone who hears the strange tap-tapping of a magpie on a window pane, another sure sign for most. In north of England, the sight of 3 butterflies together is an omen, despite their pretty dance. Should you hear the caw-caw of jackdaws, or the chattering of swallows from your chimney, beware. Either appearing down any chimney signifies that calamity is to sure follow. Always train your dogs to stay quiet after dark, for dogs howling under the window at night in the northwest of England presages an illness or death in the household, while in Northumberland, the same omen extends to anyone in the region that is suffering an illness. An old belief in the Northwest is that a dog will die when its owner passes away, and as the two souls are closely linked in death as they are in life, it's highly ominous for a dog or cat to walk or jump over a corpse awaiting burial. A 19th century tale from the borderlands tells of a funeral cortege pausing for a rest while coming down from a cottage in the High Fells. A dog jumped over the coffin when it was laid on the ground, and nobody would continue until the poor creature had been killed for its crime. Certain plants brought into a house are, it said, likely to bring calamity or death. Blackthorn blossom and primroses are included on this list, while broom should not be brought during May, and especially not used for sweeping. If you sweep the house with a broom in May, you'll sweep the head of the house away. The excitement of seeing the first snowdrop after a cold and miserable winter can entice us, but let us take the following 19th century tale from William Henderson as a lesson. A Sussex woman was heard reprimanding her child for bringing a snowdrop into the house. Asked why she should be doing so, she replied that they are obviously a token of death and look for all the world like a corpse in its shroud. Also, next time you eat a plate of broad beans, try not to consider that in Yorkshire they are thought to contain the souls of the dead. There are, of course, many night-related images of death. Superstition bids you beware of having nightmares of the devil or of one's teeth falling out, as they were both seen as sure premonitions of death. Sussex must be a terrifying place to live, as its local superstitions are full of deathly concerns. A strange rattling to a church door, or a heavy tone to the church bell, and a corpse that is unaffected by rigor mortis are sure signs of forthcoming doom. Anyone who sees a will-o'-the-wisp when out at night should consider themselves forewarned, for in Sussex, these ghostly nocturnal lights, in reality probably a natural phenomenon, can only flirt with those marked by death. At home, a stopped clock that suddenly chimes is a warning to all, as is the breaking of a mirror. The latter seen as bad luck in most parts of the world. Seating 13 people around a table is said to ensure that one guest will die before the dawn of the new year. So do be careful in making dinner plans. In many cultures, the dying are believed by some to possess supernatural powers of divination and are consulted for prophecies of what is to come. It's thought that they can communicate with the spirits of those already dead, and this power is often heightened in the prudent and pious. A more sinister tale from the Windy Walls near Stamfordham in Northumberland tells of a ghostly hand that rapped on the shutters of a house predicting the death of a member of the household. Later that evening, a man from the house did indeed fall from a cart and die, just as predicted. In Yorkshire, spirits known as fetches sometimes appear to forewarn of a death. It is wise to know your fetches from your fairies at such times. According to superstition, people born in the twilight hours or at midnight exactly are most adept at seeing spirits and are often able to predict who is soon to die. According to the Yorkshire tradition, there is a way for anyone to find out if they will die that year. At midnight, go into the barn carrying some chaff and throw open the doors. Begin to recite a riddle, any sort will do. If you are destined to die within the year, you will see a ghostly apparition of two bearers carrying a coffin appear between the open doors. However, Northumbrian tradition describes a different method. First, take the straw from the mattress or bed where someone has died and burn it. Look for a footprint in the ashes and measure the family's feet against this mark, and, a macabre Cinderella touch, whoever's foot matches the imprint will be the next to die. On St. Mark's Eve, the 24th of April, the ashes from the usual household fire can be used in the same way. Spread them out at the end of the night, and the next morning look for a footprint that matches that of a family member. It's noted in the Chambers Book of Days that a common game was for someone to sneak into the kitchen during the night with a shoe and make a playful imprint of an unsuspecting family member to find the next day, mischievously predicting their death. Perhaps not one to try at home. The same book explains the notion, common to many regions across Britain, that a morning trail of sentenced souls, those who will die in the coming year, can be seen crossing church greens at midnight on St. Mark's Eve. The vigil of watching the church porch between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. was commonly practiced from the 17th century onward. A tale from 1631 told by Mr. Liveman Rampayne, a minister from the Great Grimsby in Lincolnshire, recounts two men from Burton undertaking this, but at midnight they were bewitched, left unable to move, and pitched into darkness. Soon, by the glow of invisible torches, they watched as the minister processed into the church, followed by one of their very own neighbors, who was trussed up in a shroud. The shadowy figures entered the church, and doors slammed shut behind them. The two men outside could hear from within the mutterings of a funeral service, then the rattling of bones, and lastly, the shoveling of earth into a grave. After the ghostly service was done, the same thing occurred 5 more times, until the apparition halted and the moon shone once more brightly in the sky. Both men were so terrified by the ordeal that they were struck down with illness the next day. Ominously, the tale concludes, all of the deaths they saw came to pass within the year. Traditional superstitions are not limited to those predicting death, but also include those intended to ward off death and danger in many ways. While white pigeons serve as a portent of death, in Hull, it is said to be impossible for someone to die on a mattress or pillow containing pigeon feathers in both Cumbria and Northumberland. Let's go, earthquake and hurricane. Are you okay? Are you having another earthquake? Hi, Hunter, how are you? Thank you for the lurk, I appreciate it. Oh my goodness, you need to get out of California. In fact, a bag of feathers was often put purposefully into the pillow under the head of a dying person to keep their spirit from leaving their body, especially if waiting for someone to arrive to say their goodbyes. Be warned, though, in the 19th century, the use of pigeon feathers to ward off the inevitable was sometimes said then to cause painful lingering death. Just as superstition believed a birth could only happen when the tide was coming in, there was a comparable belief that a death could only occur when it is going out, and so those that held on might live to see another day. In Helsden, near Hartlepool, there are records from the 16th century showing that this belief was held so strongly that the tide was recorded on the parish register when noting each death in the region. Many customs were observed in the event of a death. Often in the past, the corpse was kept in the house before burial, and the relatives would wash the family member and lay them out. This is not so common today, as undertakers often take care of these rituals instead of the family members. A custom from the lowlands of Scotland in the 19th century was seining, the blessing of a corpse, which was undertaken at home. William Henderson gives a full account of this practice in his notes on the folklore of the northern counties of England and the borders, summarized as follows. The eldest woman present would light a candle and pass it about the deceased 3 times. This candle should be sourced from a witch, a wizard, or one who can see into the future. Some say the candle should be made from the fat of a murderer or a vanquished enemy. The woman would then scoop 3 handfuls of salt onto a plate and lay it on its chest, and place 3 empty bowls called tomb near the fire, as it was thought that the soul was like a flame and would flitter around the hearth just after death. In the western lowlands, a variation was that these empty bowls would be placed on a table so that the attendees could place their hands within them as they told fortunes. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it is said that for the corpse to sit up and frown was a bad omen for the one with their hand currently in the bowl. Everyone would then leave the room and then return backwards, citing this rhyme of seining. Thrice the torchy, thrice the salty, thrice the dishes tomb for lofty. These 3 times 3 ye must wave the corpse until it seems sound. Sleep sound and wake name, till to heaven the soul's gain. If ye want the soul to die, fetch the torch fray the illyrie. Gin ye want that souls to live between the dishes placed a sieve, and its sail have a fair shrive. While I was saying that, Mungo started to play with a toy, and it was really cute. Continuing, Henderson describes how the ceremony is called dishaloof, and if a sieve is placed on the chest, all try to place their hands on it, and the one who manages it will help the soul most. Although it's an ill omen for the soul if no one manages to place their hands in sieve, at this point, the windows are opened. Rhymes are sung throughout the night, and candles should be kept alight throughout, and a meal of bread, cheese, and spirits shared among them, while a game of cards is often played on the coffin itself. After this, the corpse is never left alone until burial, and is watched over by family and friends, called a sitting, during daylight hours, and like-wake after dark. It is said that everyone present should touch the corpse at least once to banish nightmares and ward off evil, and it is customary for any visitors to the house in Durham to do similar, to show no hard feelings towards the dead, and this is thought by some to originate from the belief that any murdered corpse would bleed at the touch of the perpetrator. Henderson goes on to describe how similar like-wakes are upheld in Wales, the Isles of Man, Somerset, and Cornwall. He tells that At one lie wake, a game of hide-and-seek was played, where a group of youngsters removed a corpse from the coffin, so one of them could hide within. The boy was later found dead, and the corpse nowhere to be found, so was thought to have been taken by the fairies. In the 16th century, Bishop Boise ordered that such practices should be halted and charged curates around the west of England to make sure that they didn't take place. Other customs associated with light wakes included covering mirrors and stopping clocks, a practice that crops up in other cultures and religions. It is said that mirrors were shrouded to show that all beauty and vanity has ceased with the passing, and clocks too are covered to show that time shared with the loved one is no more. In other regions, people say it was so that the departed soul would not get trapped inside them, and it's an old belief that it's bad luck to break a mirror since the soul is contained within. In both Devon and Warwickshire, it's said that if you look into a mirror in the room where a death occurred, you will see the deceased over your shoulder, looking back at you. Mirrors are removed from this room to avoid that. On the way to the funeral, it's seen as good luck to carry the dead clockwise around the church before entering, which is in the direction of the sun, since to go against this is often seen as wishing bad luck or having evil intentions. In North Wales, a corpse must always travel to the church on the right-hand side of pathways and roads and enter in Northgate. Accounts exist from as early as the 13th century that mention ancient pathways dedicated to corpse carrying. Some traditional corpse roads crossed what became private land and farms, but angry mobs were reported to have often forced their way through in order to carry the dead along these traditional corpse roads, also known as firebalks and leechways. The usual highways and roads of villages and towns was seen as unacceptable for transporting the corpse, and it's recorded that men used to pinch at such pathways, leaving the land and trying to keep them as a part of their own private property. It's said that after a funeral, a grave should never be left open on Sunday, or another death will occur within the week. In Hampshire, it was traditional to offer maidens' garlands at the funeral of any young virgin with unblemished character. These were white linen or paper garlands, with 5 paper gauntlets as a symbol of their purity. Garlands dating as far back as 1716 still hang at Abbott's Ann, near Andover today. The transition into death is steeped heavily in folklore, and a huge effort is made in paying respect to the deceased. This makes it all the more strange that in Britain there are surprisingly few traditional customs to remember the dead in the years after their passing. These are usually restricted to leaving offerings of flowers at their grave sites and lighting candles in their memory, particularly on the night of All Hallows' Eve, Halloween or All Saints' Nights, when the dead are remembered collectively. Superstitions seem to support how easily the dead are forgotten. Cornish folklore, for example, tells that portraits of the dead are thought to fade. What the dead do leave behind, however, is often used in macabre ways. In Gloucestershire, parish clerks were infamous for squirreling away old coffins and handles found in churchyards, which would later be made into rings worn on the fingers to rid the bearer of cramp. And as I finish, Mungo starts crying. But yeah, as I said, it was going to be a short stream today. We were just going to finish The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and then finish this short story about death and burial in British folklore, and I'm going to call it a night. If there's anything that you guys would like me to read or any suggestions for future streams, you can always join the Discord and leave a message with it, or just message me on Discord. Rather easy. But that being said, I'm going to call it a night. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I hope you guys have a great night.